In the spring of 1966, in a quiet neighborhood in the Bronx, New York, an elderly woman named Elsie Litt was found murdered in her apartment. The discovery was made by a concerned neighbor who hadn't seen Elsie for a couple of days. Normally, Elsie was a creature of habit. She would be out for her morning walk or tending to the small flower box on her windowsill. Her absence was noticeable, and it felt wrong. When police entered her apartment, they found a scene that was both tragic and puzzling. Elsie was in her bedroom. The official cause of death was determined to be a combination of strangulation and multiple stab wounds. The investigators on the scene noted these specific details with professional detachment. The ligature used for the strangulation appeared to be a torn piece of a dirty bedsheet twisted tightly around her neck. She had also been stabbed repeatedly with what the coroner later identified as a thin, sharp blade, something like a stiletto or a paring knife. On her bedside table, a cup of what looked like hot chocolate sat undisturbed, now cold. The apartment showed some signs of a minor struggle, but there was no forced entry. This suggested that Elsie had likely known her killer, or at least had willingly let them into her home. The police began their investigation, starting with the people who knew Elsie. But the thing was, Elsie Litt lived a very quiet life. She was a widow, her children were grown and lived in other states, and her social circle was small, mostly consisting of a few other elderly neighbors in her building. Detectives interviewed everyone they could, but no one had seen or heard anything unusual. They canvassed the neighborhood looking for witnesses, but came up empty. They processed the crime scene for fingerprints and any other forensic evidence, but in 1966, the technology was limited. The killer had been careful, leaving behind very little. The case quickly grew cold. For 9 long months, the murder of Elsie Litt remained unsolved, a troubling file in a cabinet at the local precinct. The city moved on, and for most people, the quiet old woman who was violently killed in her own home became a forgotten statistic. But for a few, the memory lingered. Fast forward 9 months to the evening of the 12th of December, 1966. A four-year-old man named Jose Lorente stood outside an apartment door, also in the Bronx, not too far from where Elsie Litt had lived. Jose was a tailor by day, a meticulous man who worked with thread and fabric. But by night, he had a different trade. He held a large, heavy bag in his hand as he knocked on the door. After a moment, the door opened, just a tiny crack. A woman's wary eyes peered out at him. She recognized him, saw the bag he was carrying, and then opened the door just enough for him to slip inside. As soon as he was in, she quickly shut the door and slid the bolt lock into place with a heavy thud. The woman was clearly on edge. She led Jose through a small hallway and into the living room. Sitting on the couch, under the dim light of a single lamp, was her son, a 4-year-old man named Ivan Barbosa. Ivan looked terrible. He had dark circles under his eyes, his posture was slumped, and he had the haunted, vacant stare of a person who hadn't had a proper night's sleep in weeks. And according to the story his mother had told Jose over the phone, that was exactly the problem. You see, Jose Lorente's second job was far more unique than his first. He was a self-proclaimed psychic medium. He specialized in conducting spiritual cleansings for people who believed they were being haunted. People like Ivan. It was Ivan's mother who had called him, desperate for help. She said her son was being tormented by the ghost of an old woman. He couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep, and he was becoming a shell of his former self. They had heard about Jose through a friend of a friend, someone who said Jose had a gift for dealing with these kinds of things. But here's the secret. Jose did not actually believe in ghosts. Not at all. He was a firm skeptic. He knew that the elaborate rituals and cleansings he performed were not supernatural. He saw them as a form of psychological therapy. In his experience, when people believed they were being haunted, it was usually a manifestation of something much more mundane, like severe stress or grief or profound loneliness. His ceremonies, with all their candles and incense and incantations, were essentially a powerful placebo. He would act the part, convincingly, and by doing so, he gave his clients the permission they needed to believe the problem was gone. And surprisingly often, it worked. They would feel better, the haunting would cease, and life would go back to normal. So, while Jose knew he was technically deceiving people, he felt the ends justified the means. He was helping people who felt they had nowhere else to turn. So on this night, Jose sat down in a chair across from Ivan and his mother. He looked at Ivan with a calm, reassuring expression and did what he always did. He asked him to tell him about the haunting. Ivan was visibly nervous, his hands trembling as he clasped them in his lap. He started to speak, his voice a low stammer at first. He explained that for months, every single night, the ghost of an old woman would appear in his room. He didn't know who she was, just that she was old and she would stand in the corner just staring at him. But recently, it had gotten worse. He said her expression was changing. Every night, she seemed to get angrier and angrier. Her silent stare had become a terrifying glare. Ivan was now so petrified that he couldn't even bring himself to go into his own bedroom at night. He was convinced this spirit meant to do him harm. He was living in a constant state of fear. Jose nodded along, listening patiently, showing deep sympathy on his face. Inwardly, he was thinking this sounded like a classic case of sleep deprivation psychosis mixed with anxiety. But he knew what mattered was that Ivan believed it was real. That was the problem he was here to fix. When Ivan finished his story, his voice trembling, Jose leaned forward slightly. He told Ivan that he understood his fear, but that he knew exactly how to help. He explained his plan. They were going to conduct a séance. The goal was to make contact with this spirit, to communicate with her, and to ask her to leave Ivan alone and find peace. Ivan looked incredibly doubtful, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and skepticism. But his mother put a reassuring hand on his shoulder, and Jose spoke with such confidence, telling them he had performed this ceremony many times and it almost always worked. Ivan, desperate for any kind of relief, finally, reluctantly, agreed. He just nodded his head slowly. Okay, let's do it. With that, Jose reached down and opened the large bag he had brought with him. He began to take out his supplies, the tools of his trade. He worked methodically, creating a specific atmosphere in the room. First, he took out several large black sheets of fabric. He carefully draped them over the television set and a small radio in the corner. This, he explained, was to symbolically shut out the noise and distractions of the outside world to create a sacred space. Next, he arranged a dozen small white candles in a large circle on the living room floor. In the very center of this circle was a low coffee table. On the table, he placed a very old, leather-bound Bible. Next to it, he set a small brass dish for incense. Once everything was in place, he went around the room and lit each candle one by one, filling the room with a soft, flickering glow. Then he lit the stick of incense, and a thin ribbon of sweet-smelling smoke began to curl up towards the ceiling. The room now felt completely different, hushed and solemn. As a final touch, Jose went to the windows and drew the blinds, plunging the room into near darkness, save for the dancing candlelight. He then asked Ivan and his mother to come and sit with him on the floor, inside the circle of candles near the coffee table. They did as he asked, settling onto the carpet. The three of them now sat in a small triangle, the air thick with anticipation. Jose began the ceremony. He picked up the old Bible from the table, opened it to a random page, and read a short prayer in a low, sonorous voice. It was a prayer for peace and protection. When he finished, he closed the book and placed it back on the table. Then he looked at Ivan, then at his mother, and told them to hold hands. Jose reached out and took Ivan's right hand and his mother's left, completing the circle. Now, he said softly, I want you both to close your eyes. Do not open them until I tell you to. They complied. The only sound in the room was the faint crackle of the candle wicks and their own breathing. And then, Jose did what he always did at this point in his seances. He spoke into the silence, his voice calm and clear. If there are any spirits in this room, he called out, we ask you to give us a sign of your presence. We mean you no harm. We are here to listen. Now, this was the part where Jose usually had to get a little creative. Typically, he would just wait. He'd listen for any random noise in the building. The groan of pipes, the floorboards settling, a gust of wind rattling the window pane. Any small sound could be interpreted as a sign from the spirit world. It was all about presentation. And if the building was too quiet, if no natural sound occurred after a minute or so, Jose had a backup plan. He would subtly tap his own foot on the floor, just hard enough for the others to hear it. Then he would say, "Did you hear that?" The spirit is making contact. It was simple but effective. So there they sat, in the dark, holding hands, eyes closed. Jose was listening, waiting for a sound he could use. A full minute passed in total silence. Nothing. He was just about to go for the foot tap trick. But then, something happened. Something that had never, ever happened to him before. An intense, jolting sensation shot through his entire body, like he had been struck by a bolt of electricity. His muscles went completely rigid. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. His vision instantly went black, as if a switch had been flipped off in his brain. And then, a series of bright, chaotic images began flashing through his mind. They came and went so fast it was a dizzying, confusing storm of pictures. He saw a cup of hot chocolate rattling on a small table. He saw a stained, torn piece of a bedsheet being twisted by a pair of dirty, grimy hands. He saw a single, wide-open eye staring in terror. A screaming mouth. Then a flash of red, then a glint of silver, then red again. The images cycled over and over, faster and faster, a terrifying, nonsensical loop. Suddenly, Jose felt his own mouth open. He wanted to scream for help, to tell them something was terribly wrong, but he had no control. Instead of his own voice, a sound came out that was completely alien. It was a high-pitched, raspy shriek. It was a voice that sounded old and full of rage, and it seemed to be coming through him, not from him. It was speaking, forming what might have been words, but the rhythm was strange, and the sound was so grating he couldn't make sense of it. The images were still flashing in his mind, everything was happening at once, and it was pure chaos. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, it stopped. The voice coming from his throat cut off. His mind went completely blank. His body, which had been rigid as a board, went totally limp. He slumped forward and slowly, very slowly, came back to himself. He found himself lying on the floor, his head on the carpet, feeling completely disoriented and weak. For a moment, he had no idea where he was or what had just happened. Then, his eyes focused. He saw the circle of candles, the incense smoke still lingering in the air. He remembered. He was in the apartment. He was doing a seance. But something had gone horribly wrong. His body ached all over, and his throat felt raw and scraped, like he'd been screaming for hours. What on earth just happened? As Jose slowly pushed himself up into a sitting position, trying to make sense of it all, his first rational thought was that he must have had some kind of seizure. A stroke, maybe. Whatever it was a medical emergency, and he probably needed to get to a hospital. But as he looked around the dimly lit room, taking in his surroundings, he noticed three things that were very, very wrong. First, the front door of the apartment, which the mother had so carefully bolted shut, was now standing wide open, letting in the faint light from the hallway. Second, Ivan's mother was cowering in the corner of the room, staring at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. She was looking at him as if he were a monster. And third, her son Ivan was gone. Jose's head was spinning, but he managed to speak. His voice was hoarse. He asked Ivan's mom, "What happened? Where's Ivan?" The story she told him in a panicked, trembling voice completely contradicted everything Jose thought he believed about the world, about science, and about ghosts. According to her, in the middle of the seance, Jose's body had suddenly gone stiff. His eyes had rolled back in his head until only the whites were showing. Then he had straightened up, his posture unnaturally rigid, and he had turned his head and looked directly at Ivan, even though his eyes were closed. And then he began to speak. But it wasn't his voice. She said it was a shrill, raspy voice, the voice of an old woman, filled with an unearthly rage. She was convinced it was the ghost that had been haunting her son, that it had taken possession of Jose's body. And this ghost, speaking through Jose, had said something to Ivan. Something so terrifying that Ivan had let out a scream, scrambled to his feet, and sprinted out of the apartment without a second's hesitation. Now, Jose was listening to this, and his rational mind was screaming that this was impossible. He was thinking, this woman was already convinced her son was being haunted. She's just interpreting what happened through that lens. I had a seizure, and it scared her and her son. That's all. There are no such things as ghosts. He tried to tell himself that over and over. But a small part of him, a part that remembered the electric shock, the blackness, the horrifying images, couldn't fully dismiss it. He couldn't explain what had happened to him. But regardless of what had actually occurred, he felt a wave of guilt. Whatever his medical episode looked like, it had clearly terrified Ivan, a young man who was already in a very fragile mental state. And now, he had run off into the night. At this point, Jose just wanted to leave. The whole situation had spiraled completely out of his control. He no longer wanted to pretend to be a psychic. He just wanted to go home. He stood up on shaky legs, began gathering his candles and his Bible, and stuffing them back into his bag. He apologized profusely to Ivan's mother, who was pleading with him to stay to explain what had happened. But Jose just shook his head. "I can't," he said. "I have to go. I'm sure Ivan will be back soon. I'm sorry." And with that, he walked out of the open door, leaving the terrified woman alone in her candlelit living room, and he went home. In the days that followed, Jose tried to put the incident out of his mind. He assumed Ivan had just gotten spooked and would eventually return home once he calmed down. He thought the family was dealing with a mental health crisis, not a supernatural one. He figured Ivan would be fine. But Ivan didn't come back home. After a few days of frantic waiting, his mother called the police and reported him missing. The police launched a search, and eventually, they found him. Ivan Barbosa was in a cheap hotel room in a neighboring town. He was dead. He had died from a single self-inflicted gunshot wound. When the police looked at the scene, it seemed like a straightforward, open-and-shut case. A troubled young man had taken his own life. That was the end of the story. But when they delivered the news to Ivan's mother, she was adamant that they were wrong. There was more to it, she insisted. And she told them over and over that they needed to talk to the psychic medium, Jose Lorente. She explained that right before her son ran away and ended his life, they had held a seance. And during that seance, Jose had said something to Ivan, something that sent him fleeing in terror. She was convinced that whatever Jose had said was the direct cause of her son's death. The police were, of course, extremely skeptical. A psychic medium? A seance? A ghost? It sounded like nonsense. They were busy people, and this sounded like the ramblings of a grieving, delusional mother. But she was persistent. She called the station every day, telling the same story, begging them to just go and talk to this man, Jose. Finally, just to appease her, 2 detectives agreed to pay him a visit. When they found Jose at his tailor shop, he was clearly shaken to hear that Ivan was dead. The detectives asked him about the seance, and Jose was surprisingly candid. He told them he didn't actually believe in ghosts, and that he thought he had suffered some kind of medical episode, maybe a seizure. He told them he had no memory of speaking during the event. "I don't remember saying anything," he explained. "All I remember is when I blacked out, I was seeing these weird visions in my head." The detectives, mostly just going through the motions, asked him, "What kind of visions?" Jose paused, trying to recall the chaotic images. He said they were jumbled and confusing, but a few of them stood out very clearly in his memory. I saw a torn bedsheet, he said, and there were dirty hands twisting it. I saw something silver, like a thin sliver of metal, like a knife. And I saw a cup of hot chocolate, and it was rattling on a table. He said it all felt like a bizarre dream and that he was sure it was just his brain misfiring during the seizure. He didn't think any of it was important. He just felt terrible that his medical problem had scared Ivan so badly. But as he was saying this, he noticed the two detectives were looking at each other. Their casual, slightly bored expressions had vanished. They were now looking at him with intense focus. One of them pulled out a notepad and said, "Sir, could you please tell us again exactly what you saw in your vision?" Jose, confused by their sudden interest, repeated the details again. The torn, dirty bedsheet. The silver knife. The rattling cup of hot chocolate. The detectives were stunned into silence. Because it turned out, those details were not random. They were the highly specific, non-public details from the 9-month-old unsolved murder case of an elderly woman named Elsie Litt. She had been strangled with a dirty, torn bedsheet. She had been stabbed with a thin, silver knife. And there had been a cup of hot chocolate on her bedside table when her body was found. These were details only the killer and the police knew. There was absolutely no way Jose Lorente, a simple tailor, should have known any of this. The police suddenly had a shocking new theory. What if Ivan wasn't being haunted by a random ghost? What if he was being haunted by the ghost of the woman he had murdered? And what did the ghost, speaking through Jose, say to him that night? The detectives went back to Ivan's mother and asked her that exact question. What were the exact words spoken during the seance? She looked at them, her eyes filled with a new kind of dread, and she told them. She said that when Jose had gone into his trance, he had looked right at her son and shrieked in that horrible old woman's voice, "You killed me, and you're going to die the same way." For Ivan, this must have been the ultimate confirmation of his worst fears. He wasn't just being haunted, he was being judged. The ghost of his victim had found him, and she was promising him a similar fate. The guilt and terror that had been manifesting as a haunting had finally culminated in a direct, terrifying accusation from the spirit world itself. He ran, not just from the apartment, but from the truth he could no longer escape. The police, armed with this incredible story, reopened the Elsie Litt murder investigation. They began to dig into Ivan Barbosa's life, looking for any connection, however small, to the murdered woman. They discovered that Ivan lived only a few blocks away from Elsie's apartment. He could have known her, at least by sight. While they never found a concrete motive, the theory they pieced together was that Ivan had likely broken into her apartment to rob her, things went wrong, and he ended up killing her. For 9 months, he got away with it. But his guilt ate away at him, twisting itself into the terrifying nightly visions of his victim. He wasn't being haunted by a ghost, he was being haunted by his own conscience. The seance was supposed to be his salvation, a way to banish the ghost. Instead, it became his final judgment. Faced with what he believed was a direct accusation from beyond the grave, he couldn't live with the guilt any longer and took his own life. Based on the chillingly accurate details provided by Jose Lorente during his unexplained trance, the police officially closed the murder case of Elsie Litt. They named Ivan Barbosa as her killer. As for Jose, he was never the same. He was a man of logic and reason, a skeptic to his core. But he had experienced something that night that he could never logically explain. He had no memory of speaking Elsie Litt's judgment, but the evidence was undeniable. He had, it seemed, become a genuine conduit for the spirit world. The experience terrified him so much that he immediately gave up his work as a psychic medium and never conducted another seance again. Tonight's stories remind us that sometimes the most unsettling mysteries are not those hidden in the dark, but those concealed within the human mind. Whether it is guilt, fear, coincidence, or something much more inexplicable, each of these cases leaves behind questions that haunt people for decades afterward. One afternoon in March of 2004, a 53-year-old handyman named Carl Fenwick was sitting on the floor of a vacant studio apartment. He was in a somewhat run-down apartment building where he both lived and worked, located in a coastal town in northern England called Satan Carew. The building itself was called The Cliff, and it was perched right across the street from the ocean, offering a wide, gray view of the water. Carl was in the middle of a job, painting the apartment to get it ready for a new tenant, but he'd taken a break. He had his lunch spread out on a dust sheet beside him and was deep into one of his favorite spy novels. Carl was a huge fan of spy stories. He had a small collection of books that he would just read over and over again, finding something new in them each time. But as he was about to turn a page, a movement outside the window pulled his attention away from the book. He looked out and saw his landlady, a woman named Anne Darwin. She lived in a large Victorian house right next door to the apartment building. At that moment, she was standing in front of her house, but she wasn't alone. She was with her 2 adult sons, Anthony and Mark. What struck Carl immediately was that all 3 of them were dressed entirely in black, and each one was holding a wreath made of flowers. Feeling a bit like one of the spies from his novels, Carl stayed low and watched from the window. He saw the family of 3 walk across the street together, moving towards a grassy knoll that overlooked the sea. From his vantage point, he watched as Anne and her sons stood there for a moment, then bowed their heads. He could tell they were likely praying or sharing a moment of quiet remembrance. Then, one by one, all 3 of them tossed their wreaths into the ocean, watching as the waves carried them away. Carl knew exactly what this was about. They were honoring Anne's husband, John Darwin. 2 years earlier, John had died in a tragic kayaking accident right there in the waters just in front of their house. As Carl watched, he could see Anne's shoulders shaking. It was clear she was crying, and seeing her grief made him feel a pang of sadness himself. Carl cared deeply for Anne. Their relationship was complicated. He wasn't just her handyman and tenant, they had been secretly and romantically involved for almost 2 years, ever since he had first moved into the cliff. But Carl's connection to Anne went back much further than that. He had known her for most of his life, and, if he was being honest with himself, he had been in love with her for decades. Both Carl and Anne had grown up in a town near Satan Carew. The very first time Carl ever saw her was on the school bus back in high school. He had been completely captivated by her but was too shy to ever work up the courage to say hello. Soon after, he left for college, but the memory of her never really faded. After finishing his education, Carl went on to build a life of his own. He became a school teacher and started a family. But his life took a sharp downturn after he made a series of really bad real estate investments. His financial troubles spiraled into legal troubles, and eventually, it all fell apart. He ended up leaving his family and going on the run from the police. He found himself living in the woods just outside of Satan Carew, a shadow of the man he once was. And that's when fate, or something like it, brought him and Anne back into each other's lives. One evening, he was near his campsite when he saw a car pull into a nearby parking lot. He recognized Anne at the wheel, and she looked incredibly upset. This time, all these years later, he decided to approach her. He walked over to her car and gently knocked on the window. It turned out that her husband's kayaking accident had happened only a few weeks before. She was emotionally shattered and completely overwhelmed. On top of her grief, she was also desperate for help managing the properties she and her husband had owned together. That very same night, she offered him a place to stay. She let him move into one of the empty apartments at the cliff. And once Carl was settled in, their relationship slowly blossomed into a quiet, unconventional romance. His days were spent working, fixing up the apartments in the building. His nights were spent with Anne in her house next door. Keeping their relationship a secret was strange for both of them, but they each had their reasons. Carl was terrified of being arrested. He was still a wanted man, so if anyone knew his true identity or where he was, it would all be over. For Anne, the situation was different. She felt that her family and friends expected her to be a grieving widow, possibly for the rest of her life. She was worried about what people would think if it looked like she had moved on so quickly after her husband's death. Their shared dream was that at some point, Anne could sell her properties. They would take the money, move far away together, and start a completely new life. But they both knew it was a long shot. The biggest hurdle was Carl. He would first have to figure out a way to leave the country without a valid passport and without getting arrested. Back in the apartment, Carl watched as Anne and her sons made their way back across the street and into their house. He sighed, picked up his spy novel, and went back to reading. But he wasn't just reading for pleasure anymore. As he followed the story's plot and the actions of the main character, he was making mental notes. He was actively searching for inspiration, for a clever trick or a loophole he could use. Carl was working on a grand plan, a plan that he hoped would finally allow him and Anne to escape and start their new life together. He was using these spy novels as his textbooks. A small smile crept onto his face as he thought about how brilliant his scheme was. He even imagined that someday in the future, an author might write a spy novel about him. It would take another 2 long years for Carl to finalize every detail of his plan. But finally, one morning in July of 2006, he was ready. He walked through the airport near Satan Karu, trying his best to look casual and blend in with the other travelers. He approached the ticketing counter, his heart pounding in his chest. He handed his passport to the gate agent, then glanced over his shoulder. He saw Anne standing at the back of the line. Their eyes met for just a second before she quickly looked away. They had agreed to pretend they didn't know each other, just in case something went wrong. When Carl turned back, he saw the ticketing agent staring intently at his passport. His heart rate kicked up another notch. This was the moment of truth. The passport he was using was a fake. He had meticulously created a whole new identity for himself. He had used the birth and death records of a baby who had been born in the same year as him but had died in infancy. It was an idea he'd lifted directly from one of his favorite spy novels, The Day of the Jackal, which was about an assassin who constantly changed identities. If this worked, if this agent bought the fake passport, he and Anne would be on a flight to Panama in Central America. Carl's plan was to stay there permanently. He hoped that Anne would fall in love with the place and eventually move there to be with him. He had read a travel brochure on Panama that described it as a place for schemers, dreamers, and nutcases. That description made him feel like he would fit right in. Plus, the cost of living was incredibly low compared to the UK, and it was thousands of miles away from anyone who might recognize him. It seemed like the perfect place for them to disappear. But everything hinged on this one moment. It all depended on his fake passport being convincing enough to get past this agent. After what felt like an eternity, the agent looked up from the passport, smiled, and handed it back to Carl along with his boarding pass. Carl had to physically restrain himself from letting out a huge sigh of relief. Instead, he just gave a casual thank you to the agent. As he walked away from the counter, he turned back one more time and gave a subtle wink to Anne, who was still waiting in line. After decades of just reading about international spies, Carl felt like he had finally become one. And he had to admit, he liked the feeling a lot. Soon, he would be living full-time as John Jones, an international man of mystery. A few days later, Carl sat beside Anne in the back of a Jeep. A real estate agent was driving them through the lush Panamanian countryside. They sped along a highway that cut through the jungle, and with every mile, Carl felt more alive than he had in years. They came around a sharp bend in the road, and suddenly, the dense jungle gave way to a stunning, sandy beach. The realtor pulled the car over and told them to get out, to take a look around and see if this particular plot of land felt like it could be their new home. Carl had done the math 100 times. Once Anne sold the apartment building and combined that money with the life insurance payout she had received after her husband's death, they would have around £600,000 in savings. That was roughly 800,000 American dollars. It was more than enough to get them set up, but they would need a steady source of income in Panama as well. That's where this land came in. Carl's big idea was to buy this piece of jungle paradise and open an eco-lodge resort. These types of resorts were becoming incredibly popular in Central America. Tourists would pay good money to stay in rustic beachside cabins for a week, go canoeing, horseback riding, and trekking through the jungle. Carl also planned to build a private villa on the property just for him and Anne, right there on the beach. He led Anne down to the edge of the water and pointed across the bay to the tree line. He told her to imagine a row of beautiful cabins nestled among the trees. He described a long dock stretching out into the water with a bunch of canoes tied up to it. He talked about a path that would lead from the cabins to a horse stable hidden in the woods. Then he pointed to the opposite side of the bay and told her to picture a magnificent seaside villa, their home, where the two of them would live out their days. Anne kicked off her sandals and waded into the warm water. Carl could see it in her eyes. She was picturing it, imagining the life they could have here. For Carl, it felt like years of meticulous, risky planning were finally about to pay off. This trip had been the best week of his entire relationship with Anne. For the first time, they could act like a normal couple. They went out to dinner in public every night. They walked down the street holding hands without fear. Carl loved being John Jones. He felt a sense of freedom he hadn't experienced in a very long time. And oddly enough, even though his identity was a complete fabrication, he felt more like his old self, the person he was before all the debt and the legal problems had crushed him. By the time they got back to the realtor's office that afternoon, Anne was completely sold on the idea. She told Carl that she was taken with Panama and that yes, she wanted to move here with him. She promised that as soon as she got back to England, she would get her affairs in order and prepare for the big move. Carl was beaming. Their realtor, sensing the happy moment, grabbed a camera and took a picture of the three of them to commemorate the day they decided to change their lives forever. It took another full year for Anne to sort everything out back home. She had to sell her properties in Satan, Carew, and even more difficult, she had to tell her family that she was moving to Panama of all places. They were all shocked at first. It seemed like such a random and drastic decision, but eventually they came to understand. They believed she needed to get away from England and all the unhappy memories of her old life with John. Shortly after Anne sold the last of the properties, Carl used some of their funds to buy a condominium in Panama City. It would be a place for them to live while they were building their dream resort. And then, finally, on the 22nd of October 2007, Anne moved to Panama for good. That night, Carl picked her up from the airport and drove her to their new home. As he drove, he had to force a smile. He had recently discovered some news, some terrible news, that was going to throw their entire new life into jeopardy. He gave Anne a quick tour of their penthouse apartment, then asked her to sit down at the kitchen table. Anne immediately sensed that something was wrong. Her expression shifted from excitement to worry. Carl took a deep breath. He told Anne how excited he was to build their resort together, but then he dropped the bomb. There was one last, unexpected obstacle standing in their way. He explained that he had only learned about it a few weeks ago and had been waiting for the right moment to tell her in person. He had discovered that the Panamanian government had recently instituted new procedures for anyone moving to the country. All new residents, including English citizens, now needed to present a certificate of good conduct from the British police. This was to prove they had no criminal record. For Anne, this was no problem at all. But for Carl, it was a catastrophe. He was living in Panama as John Jones. If the authorities looked into his identity, they would very quickly discover that John Jones didn't really exist. Anne put her head in her hands and whispered, "What are we going to do?" Carl admitted that he didn't have an answer yet, but he promised her that he would figure something out. He always did. The next morning, Carl walked with Anne along a busy street in Panama City. They window shopped, but Carl's mind was racing. He was trying to think of any possible way he could get around this awful new procedure. He didn't want to live in Panama illegally. He was done with hiding. The whole point of coming here was so that he and Anne could finally live their lives together out in the open. He followed Anne into an old vintage shop where she was looking at furniture for their new apartment. As he wandered aimlessly around the store, he came across a bookshelf filled with old books. He saw a few spy novels among them. All the books were in Spanish, so he couldn't read them, but he picked one up anyway. He began flipping through the pages, just hoping for some kind of spark, some kind of inspiration. And as he stood there, an idea did come to him. But it wasn't inspired by the book in his hands. He suddenly remembered the plot of a different spy novel, one he had read more than a decade ago. At the time he read it, he had thought the central plot was absolutely insane, far too crazy to ever work in real life. But now, as he and Anne walked around the city that afternoon, he kept coming back to that idea. He started to turn it over in his mind, seeing how he might just be able to adapt it to his own situation. Finally, at dinner that night, Carl told Anne that he was pretty sure he knew how to solve their visa problem once and for all. He warned her that the idea was incredibly risky, maybe the riskiest thing they had ever attempted. But he was confident that he could pull it off. 6 weeks later, on the afternoon of Sunday, the 2nd of December 2007, Carl was back in the United Kingdom. He was wandering around the West End of London, doing his best to look utterly lost and confused. He walked through streets decorated with festive Christmas displays, looking around with a vacant expression until a concerned store clerk came over to ask if he was okay. Carl gave her a shy, hesitant smile and asked, "Why are all the Christmas decorations up?" When she told him it was because it was December, he pretended to be baffled, as if he had no idea what month or even what year it was. He claimed he didn't know where he was. He then asked the clerk for help. Just as he had hoped, the store clerk frowned with concern. She took him by the arm and escorted him to the nearest police station. Inside, she explained to the officer at the front desk that something was seriously wrong with this man. The officer smiled kindly at Carl and asked him what the problem was. Carl knew that what he did next had to be an award-winning acting performance. The success of his entire plan depended on it. He scratched at his head, looked at the officer with pleading eyes, and said that he thought he had lost his whole family. The officer's demeanor immediately became more serious. He sat up straighter and asked for his name. And for the first time in 2 years, Carl didn't say John Jones. Instead, he gave the officer his real name. Carl had come to a realization. The only way he could ever truly feel like his old self again in Panama was to actually become his old self. He needed to reclaim the identity he had left behind. But to do that without also reclaiming all his old debt and his outstanding legal problems, it was going to require one more colossal lie. Carl looked the police officer in the eye and explained that he knew his name, but that was it. He claimed he couldn't remember anything else about himself because, he said, he had amnesia. The officer just stared at him, obviously dumbfounded. He then turned and called for his supervisor. From that moment on, things started to move very, very fast, but not at all in the direction that Carl had expected. Carl had believed that by claiming amnesia, he could essentially wipe his slate clean in England. He figured he could resume his old life under his real name, make a plan to pay back his creditors now that he was in a better financial position, and then get a real, legitimate passport. With that, he and Anne could live happily and truly openly in Panama. But that is not what happened. Almost immediately, the newspapers caught wind of his incredible story, and it exploded. It made the front page. To the rest of the world, Carl had a story that was almost unbelievable. He had supposedly spent years wandering around as a homeless person, a man with no memory of his past, no knowledge of his own identity. Almost overnight, he became a massive international news sensation. The entire world wanted to know, where had this man been for the past few years? Carl had not anticipated any of this publicity. He and Anne were both horrified. Their horror turned to pure panic when 2 days later, a British newspaper published a photograph they had found on an obscure real estate website in Panama. In the picture, Carl could be seen standing next to Anne and their realtor. All three of them were beaming with happiness after a successful day of viewing properties. This photograph was very, very bad for Carl. It was irrefutable proof that he had not been wandering around the UK homeless with amnesia, just as he had told the police. But the photo was even worse for Anne. It was devastating, because it proved something far more shocking, far more terrible than simple financial fraud. This one picture unraveled a story so outlandish that it sounded like it must have come directly from the pages of a fictional spy novel. It would turn out that Anne was not the grieving widow she had pretended to be for years. And her handyman boyfriend, Carl Fenwick, was not Carl Fenwick at all. Carl's real name, the one he had given to that police officer in London when he was faking amnesia, was John Darwin. He was Anne Darwin's supposedly dead husband. The two of them had faked his death in that kayaking accident all those years ago. It was an elaborate scheme to escape his crippling debt and so that they could fraudulently claim his life insurance money. Not even their own sons knew their father was still alive. For years, they had grieved for a man who was secretly living right next door. Only Anne and, of course, John were in on the secret. John and Anne were both quickly arrested for fraud. They ended up serving more than 3 years in prison. In a strange way, John's very unhappy ending mirrors the ending of the very book he used for inspiration, The Day of the Jackal. In that novel, the assassin pulls off a series of impressive feats to change his identity and evade capture, but in the end, he still gets caught. Today's second and final story is about a man who makes an unforgivable mistake and pays dearly for it. At around noon on the 9th of October 2018, a 52-year-old Russian engineer named Oleg Bologosov sat in the common room of a tiny research station. This station was located on a remote, frozen island in Antarctica. The common room served as the general multi-purpose hangout area for the station's crew. Oleg was sitting there watching television while his coworker, a man named Sergei, sat in a chair nearby, quietly reading a book. They were both drinking alcohol and had been for a while. When they weren't on duty, there really wasn't much else to do in that isolated place besides sit around and drink. Oleg had been at the station for about 6 months at this point. He was part of a 14-person crew on a year-round research mission. Their job was to observe the island's ocean and weather patterns, collecting data for their home country of Russia. Oleg's primary responsibility was maintaining the station's machinery and equipment, which kept him busy for a good portion of the day. But there was still a significant amount of downtime, and Oleg spent almost all of it inside. Being outside in Antarctica was generally a very bad idea. The landscape was riddled with hundreds of lethal, deep ice crevasses, many of them barely visible under the snow. If you fell into one, you were dead. The fall itself could kill you, or you would simply be trapped and freeze. On top of that, there were the obviously freezing temperatures and the constant threat of violent, lethal blizzards. It was a place that was fundamentally not built for human beings. So, Oleg and his coworkers only ever went outside when their work absolutely required it. Otherwise, they were confined to the station's buildings. And inside, their entertainment options were severely limited. There was a television that only got 2 channels. There was a small gym. There was a nearby church. And there was a library. By this point in his tour, Oleg was sick of all of it. He was even tired of the library, which was a shame because he loved to read. But the library was tiny, and he had already read almost every single book on its shelves. His colleague, Sergei, who was sitting near him, also loved to read. Books were one of the few things the two men actually spent a lot of time talking about. Since Oleg couldn't find anything interesting to watch on the 2-channel TV and was feeling intensely bored and stir-crazy, he decided to see if Sergei was in the mood for one of their deep, literary conversations. Oleg turned off the TV, tossed the remote onto a chair, and took a long swig of his drink. He glanced over to the corner where Sergei was absorbed in his book. He saw the cover. It was the novel Fight Club. Oleg had already read it. The book is about a depressed man suffering from insomnia who meets a charismatic stranger and starts a secret club where people just literally fight each other. Oleg thought the book was amazing, mostly because it had one of the most epic plot twists he had ever read. So, Oleg got up and walked over to Sergei. He asked him what he thought of the book so far. But Sergei just grunted and kept reading, effectively ignoring him. Oleg wasn't surprised by this. He knew Sergei very well. The two of them had worked closely together on various research projects over the years. He knew that Sergey was a generally quiet person and not a big talker, whereas Oleg loved to get into long, passionate discussions about everything and anything. Sometimes, Oleg could coax Sergey out of his shell by asking a lot of questions or telling jokes. But today did not seem to be one of those days. This was frustrating for Oleg, but he could take a hint. He could tell that Sergey just wanted to be left alone to read. So, he stood up and left the common room to go find something else to do. Oleg spent the next few hours just wandering around the station, checking some of the research logs, and continuing to sip his drink. He briefly thought about going outside just for a minute to get some fresh air. But when he checked the outdoor temperature, he saw that it was well below freezing. He decided against it. So, after 3 hours of trying and failing to kill time, Oleg finally gave up and headed to the cafeteria to get a bite to eat. It was around 3 in the afternoon when Oleg stepped into the dining room. He was feeling a bit flushed from all the booze he had been drinking all day. And the first person he saw when he got inside was Sergey. He was sitting at a table, still reading Fight Club, just as he had been doing hours earlier in the common room. Oleg got himself some food and then went over to sit with Sergey. He figured he'd try again and see if maybe now he was more open to chatting. And to his surprise, he was. When Oleg sat down, Sergey actually put his book down on the table and looked up, ready to talk. It was possible that he had also had a lot to drink by this point and was feeling a bit more sociable. So the two men began to discuss the book Fight Club. Very quickly, their conversation became really energetic. They were both a bit drunk and were getting excited about the points they were making. Then, Oleg made what he thought was a fantastic and insightful point about the book and its deeper meaning. To Oleg, it seemed like the conversation was going great. But then, all of a sudden, right after he made his point, Oleg noticed that Sergey had gone completely silent. His face had changed. Oleg, who could read Sergey very well by now, knew what this meant. Sergey was done talking. He wanted some space again. Oleg glanced down at his watch. He realized he actually did need to get some more work done before the day was over. He was about to look up and tell Sergey that he was going to go leave to check on one of their weather instruments. But when he looked up from his watch, Sergey was gone. He had vanished from the table. And at that exact same moment, a wild, agonized scream cut through the air right behind Oleg. A few minutes later, in another building at the station, the research station's manager was in his office, going through some paperwork. Suddenly, his office door flew open with a bang. The manager looked up and saw one of his employees standing in the doorway, looking absolutely panicked. The employee's eyes were wide, and his breath was coming in ragged gasps, like he was in a state of shock. When the employee managed to explain why he was so upset, the manager shot to his feet and told the man not to move. He then grabbed his heavy coat and flew out the door, into the brutal, freezing cold. The manager struggled to pull on his coat as he ran across the ice-packed ground, heading for the building that housed the cafeteria. The whole way there, he felt his own panic growing and growing. Because what that employee had just told him was something that had never, ever happened at their research station before. In fact, he wasn't even sure if it had ever happened on the entire continent of Antarctica before. When the manager finally reached the cafeteria, he flung the door open and looked inside. What he saw made him feel immediately sick to his stomach. It would turn out that Oleg and Sergey had been coworkers for a very long time. And because they knew each other so well, Oleg had learned over the years what specific things really truly annoyed Sergey. And Oleg, it seems, used this knowledge whenever he got bored and wanted to find a way to entertain himself. The way Oleg would intentionally upset Sergey was by violating a very serious, unspoken rule that virtually every human being knows not to violate. Every single time Sergey would start reading a new book, Oleg would wait until he was about halfway through, and then he would spoil the ending for him. This wasn't just a one-time thing. It was a pattern. Whenever they talked about books, Oleg repeatedly and deliberately ruined them for Sergey, which always made Sergey incredibly angry. And that day, in the cafeteria, when Oleg sat down with Sergey, he didn't just make a great point about the book Fight Club. He told Sergey exactly how it ended. He revealed the big, famous twist. And Sergei, who was very drunk and who, like Oleg, had also been feeling very restless and tense from having been cooped up in that isolated station for months on end, finally snapped. This time, when Oleg spoiled the ending, Sergei completely lost control. He went into the kitchen, grabbed a knife, walked up behind Oleg, and began repeatedly stabbing him in the chest, all while allegedly screaming, "Didn't see that coming, did you?" Once Sergei had calmed down, he was so shocked and horrified by what he had done that he immediately walked to the manager's office and turned himself in. He was then transported all the way back to Russia and arrested. He was eventually acquitted, however, since he had no previous criminal record. As for Oleg, his heart was severely damaged in the attack, but amazingly, after being evacuated to a hospital, he would survive. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Some stories you hear seem to sit right on the edge of what we understand. They feel like they could be true, they have all the pieces of a real event, but there's always one detail, one piece of the puzzle that just doesn't fit into our world. Tonight, we're going to look at 3 such stories. They are separated by time and distance, but they all share that one chilling detail that pushes them from the ordinary into something else entirely. We begin on a quiet farm in rural Ohio in the summer of 1921. A young man named Carl Logis stood on the porch of his new farmhouse, looking out at the land he now owned. It was a warm evening, and the crickets were chirping their endless song. He took a deep breath of the country air. This was it. This was everything he had ever worked for. Carl was not a complicated man. He had a simple dream, one that he'd held on to since he was a boy, to own his own piece of land, to work it with his own 2 hands, and to live a quiet, self-sufficient life. And now, against all odds, he had it. The farm was modest, with a small house, a sturdy barn, and a reliable water well. The fields stretched out into the darkness, promising a future of hard work and honest reward. He'd even managed to buy it for a surprisingly low price. The family who sold it to him had been in a huge hurry to leave. They didn't say much about why, just that they were ready for a change, ready for the city. Carl didn't ask too many questions. A good deal was a good deal, and he saw it as his good fortune. He stepped off the porch, a lantern in one hand, its yellow light cutting a small circle in the deep darkness of the night. He had a pistol holstered on his hip, more out of habit than any real sense of danger. It was time for his final check of the animals before turning in for the night. His horses and cattle were his livelihood, and he took their care seriously. As he walked across the yard, the crunch of his boots on the dry soil was the only sound besides the crickets. He looked back at his little farmhouse, its windows dark, and then ahead towards the large, dark shape of the barn. He felt a swell of pride. This was all his. He was alone out here, master of his own small world. And then, the feeling came. It was sudden and sharp. A prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the kind that makes you feel like you've been caught doing something you shouldn't. He felt with absolute certainty that he was being watched. He stopped dead in his tracks. But that was impossible. He lived completely alone. His nearest neighbor was miles away. There were no roads nearby that people would be walking on this late at night. It was just him, his land, and his animals. Instinctively, he whipped around, raising the lantern high. The light swung wildly, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to jump and flee. He scanned the open fields, the line of trees in the distance, the area around the farmhouse. Nothing. Just the empty, dark landscape. He listened intently, holding his breath. He heard nothing but the wind rustling through the tall grass. His practical mind immediately started searching for a rational explanation. A predator, maybe? A coyote or a fox? He looked around again. The night was peaceful. The crickets hadn't stopped their chirping, which they usually did if a large predator was near. And the previous owners hadn't mentioned any problems with dangerous animals in the area. He shook his head, a small, frustrated sigh escaping his lips. He was just being paranoid. That had to be it. He was new to this property, new to living so isolated. Every little sound, every shadow was magnified by the darkness and the silence. He told himself to calm down, that he was just letting his imagination get the better of him. "Go check your animals and go to bed," he muttered to himself. "Everything is fine." He turned and continued his walk to the barn, his pace a little quicker than before. He slid open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The familiar smells of hay and livestock filled the air, and the gentle sounds of the animals shifting in their stalls were comforting. He set about his work, topping off their water, checking their feed, making sure everything was secure for the night. He busied himself for a few minutes, his mind focused on the simple, repetitive tasks. For a little while, he managed to forget about that strange, unsettling feeling he'd had outside. He was finishing up, giving one of his horses a final pat on the neck, when the feeling returned. This time, it was even stronger. It was an intense, piercing feeling, as if a pair of eyes were boring right into his back. He stood frozen for a moment, then slowly turned to look out the open barn door. The yard was empty, bathed in the pale light of the moon. He couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. He scanned the dark corners of the barn itself, the hayloft above. Nothing. Still, the feeling persisted. He was not alone. He tried to tell himself again that it was just his nerves, but deep down, a cold knot of fear was tightening in his stomach. The walk back to the farmhouse, which a few minutes ago had been a source of pride, now seemed like a long and treacherous journey through enemy territory. But he couldn't stay in the barn all night. He took a deep breath to steel his resolve. He picked up his lantern, and his other hand instinctively went to the gun on his hip, his fingers resting on the worn leather of the holster. He stepped out of the barn and began walking quickly towards the house, his head on a swivel, scanning the darkness on either side of him. He was about halfway across the yard when a flicker of movement caught his eye. It was on the far side of his property, out in the distance. He stopped, his heart pounding in his chest. He raised his lantern, aiming the beam in that direction. The light was weak at that distance, but it was enough. He could clearly see a figure. Someone was standing on his land. They were just standing there, perfectly still, a tall, pale silhouette against the dark fields. It looked almost white in the dim light. For a second, Carl was too shocked to move. He just stood there, holding the lantern, staring at this silent intruder. The figure was standing near his water well. Finally, his shock gave way to anger. "Hey!" he yelled, his voice cutting through the quiet of the night. "Who are you? What are you doing on my property?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't even seem to flinch. It just stood there, seemingly staring right back at him. Then, slowly, it turned and began to move. It wasn't walking or running. It was more like it was gliding, moving away from Carl and towards the water well. That's when Carl's fear and anger boiled over. This was a trespasser. This must have been who was watching him earlier. Were they trying to rob him? Scope out his property? He wasn't going to let them get away. He drew his gun from its holster and started running towards the figure, shouting for them to stop. As he ran, the lantern in his other hand swung back and forth, making the light unsteady. The white figure seemed to flicker in and out of view between the bouncing shadows. He was closing the distance, but the figure was moving with an unnatural speed. He lost sight of it for a moment behind a small rise in the ground. By the time he reached the water well, panting and out of breath, the person was gone. They had just vanished. He stood there, scanning the area in every direction. There was nowhere for them to have gone so quickly. The fields were wide open. There were no trees or buildings to hide behind. It was as if they had just dissolved into the night air. Carl didn't know what to think. Was this person playing games with him? Had they circled back around to his house while he was chasing them? The uncertainty was terrifying. All he could think to do was yell out into the darkness. He warned them that he had a gun and he wasn't afraid to use it. He told them to get off his property and never come back. But his threats were met with nothing but silence. The crickets had stopped chirping now. The night was eerily still. For a long time, Carl just stood there by the well, his gun still in his hand, his eyes straining to see any sign of movement in the darkness. But the figure never reappeared. Eventually, the cold night air began to seep into his bones. He knew he couldn't stand out here all night. With one last paranoid look around, he turned and ran the rest of the way to his farmhouse. He burst through the door, slammed it shut, and slid the bolt home. The next morning, with the sun streaming through his windows, the events of the previous night felt like a bad dream. Carl tried to rationalize it. It must have been a local prankster, or maybe a neighbor who was too shy to introduce themselves properly. Or perhaps it was a would-be thief who got scared off when Carl shouted and drew his gun. Whatever it was, he told himself it was a one-time thing. He had stood his ground, and they wouldn't be back. He desperately wanted to believe that. But he was wrong. That night, and almost every single night for the next year, the same thing happened. Around 9:30 p.m., just as Carl would be heading out to the barn for his final check, he would see the figure. It was always there, standing at a distance, a pale shape watching him from the edge of his property. It never got any closer, and he could never make out any features. It was just a silent, ever-present observer. Every night, Carl would scream at it, curse at it, tell it to leave. He would run towards it, his gun in his hand. One night, in a fit of rage and desperation, he even fired a shot in its direction. But every single time, the outcome was the same. The figure would turn, glide silently towards the water well, and then, right around that area, it would simply vanish. As the months wore on, Carl's initial anger and fear slowly turned into a kind of weary resignation. He wanted to believe it was just a persistent trespasser, someone with a strange obsession who was impossibly good at hiding. But he knew deep down that wasn't the case. Though he was not a superstitious man, he couldn't deny what he was seeing. The way it moved, the way it disappeared into thin air, it had to be a ghost. What else could it be? And then he would remember the family who sold him the farm, how eager they were to leave, how they practically gave the place away. He started to think that maybe their hurry to get out had something to do with his nightly visitor. But as terrifying as it was to live with a ghost on his property, Carl clung to one fact. It was predictable. It appeared at the same time, in the same area, and it never did anything more than just watch. It never came near the house, never bothered his animals. It was a frightening, but ultimately harmless, part of his new normal. He learned to live with it. That is, until the 1st of August 1922, almost exactly 1 year to the day after he had bought the farm. On that day, something changed. Carl went out to water his horses and cattle, just as he did every day. But this time, they wouldn't drink. They shied away from the troughs, snorting and stamping their feet nervously. They acted as if the water was poisoned. Carl was baffled. It was the same water from the same well they had been drinking for a year without any issue. He cupped his hands and tasted it himself. It tasted fine to him, clean and fresh. But the animals were adamant. Something was wrong with the water. He realized the only way to solve the problem was to clean out the well. He would have to drain all the existing water, scrub the inside, and let it refill with fresh, clean groundwater. So, Carl went over to the well, the very spot where the ghostly figure disappeared every night. He set up the pump and began the long, laborious process of draining it. As the water level slowly dropped, he peered down into the dark opening. He saw something. There was something large at the bottom of the well, something that had been hidden deep beneath the surface of the water. As the water level got lower and lower, the object became clearer. It wasn't a rock or a piece of old equipment. It was a tangled mess of what looked like old clothes and bones. His blood ran cold. He knew immediately what he had to do. He stopped the pump and ran to get the sheriff. The discovery at the bottom of the well reopened a 5-year-old cold case. It turned out that before Carl, and even before the family who sold him the farm, the property had been owned by a man named Frank Lerman. Frank had employed several farmhands, including a young man named Henry Lipenstick. One day, 5 years earlier, Henry had simply vanished. He had no family or close friends in the area, so most people just assumed he had packed up and left town to find work elsewhere. But one of Frank's neighbors had her doubts. She went to the sheriff at the time and told him that she didn't think Henry had just left. She thought Frank Lerman might have had something to do with his disappearance. She said the two of them argued constantly, usually about money. She could hear them shouting at each other from her own property. She said there was real, palpable tension between them. The sheriff had tried to investigate her claim. He went to speak with Frank, but just as the investigation was getting started, Frank abruptly sold the farm and moved away without a forwarding address. With no body and no real evidence of foul play, the sheriff had no choice but to close the case. Until now. 5 years later, the body found at the bottom of Carl Logisa's well was identified as Henry Lipenstick. His remains were badly decomposed, mostly skeletal, but identification was confirmed. An autopsy revealed that Henry had died from blunt force trauma to the head. His death was officially ruled a homicide. Frank Lerman was tracked down, arrested, and charged with second-degree murder. He was found guilty, but the conviction didn't stick. After only 7 months, his charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence from so long ago, and he was released. But there was one more detail, one final, chilling piece to the story. When they carefully removed Henry's remains from the well to give him a proper burial, they noticed he was still wearing a watch on his skeletal wrist. The watch was broken, its hands frozen in time. It had stopped at 9:35 p.m. This was almost precisely the time, every single night for a year, that Carl Logis had seen that white, ghostly figure running towards the well before disappearing. After Henry Lipenstick's body was finally recovered and laid to rest in a proper grave, Carl Logis never saw the white figure on his farm ever again. The haunting was over. Our next story takes us forward in time a bit to the winter of 1933 and to a grand castle in southern Poland. Inside one of the castle's many lavish sitting rooms, a young nobleman named Anton Holberg was hosting a party for his friends. The room was filled with laughter and the smoke from expensive cigars. Anton, already quite drunk, was attempting to pour another round of drinks. He weaved his way back towards the card table where his friends were playing blackjack, but he stumbled, spilling most of the liquor onto a priceless carpet. Instead of being embarrassed, he just found it hilarious. So did his friends. They all roared with laughter as he clumsily picked up the nearly empty glasses from the floor. As a joke, he continued to the table and handed out the empty cups, and his friends, equally drunk and jovial, played along pretending to toast with them. The dealer for the next round began to pass out the cards. And it was in that moment that a loud, groaning creak echoed down from the ceiling right above them. The sound was so distinct and so loud that it cut through the noise of the party. Everyone stopped what they were doing and looked up. A moment of silence fell over the room. In that sudden quiet, Anton grinned and waved a dismissive hand. "Oh boy," he said with a chuckle. "That's just the monk." Most of his friends at the table knew what he was talking about. They had all heard Anton's favorite story about the castle being haunted by a so-called hooded monk. But there was one new friend in the group that night who hadn't heard the tale. He looked at Anton with a confused expression. "The monk? What are you talking about?" The other friends groaned playfully. They knew what was coming. Anton's eyes lit up. He loved telling this story. He turned to his new friend and launched into his well-rehearsed tale. He explained that when he first took ownership of the castle, he was told by the previous owners that the entire estate was his to enjoy, with one exception. There was a single bedroom on the second floor that was to remain locked and untouched at all times. The reason, they claimed, was that the room was haunted by the malevolent spirit of a hooded monk who patrolled it endlessly. Anton admitted to his friends that he had always heeded the warning. He had never once set foot inside that room. He had dozens of other bedrooms, so he didn't need it, but more than that, a part of him actually believed the story might be true. He liked the idea that his grand castle had a genuine, terrifying secret. He concluded his story by pointing a finger towards the ceiling. "And that bedroom," he said with a dramatic flair, "is right above us. So maybe that creak we just heard really was the monk." Usually, his friends would just humor him and move on. It was just a silly ghost story Anton liked to tell. But tonight, the new friend's reaction changed the dynamic. He stared at Anton in disbelief. "Wait a minute," he said. "You're telling me you own this entire castle, but there's a room in it that you've never been inside just because of some old ghost story? Are you serious?" As he said it out loud, the other friends started to see it from a new perspective. It did sound a bit cowardly when you put it like that. Suddenly, Anton's fun ghost story made him seem weak. They all started to pile on. "Yeah, Anton, what's the deal?" "It's your castle." "You can't be scared of one little room." Anton's cheerful mood quickly soured. He tried to brush it off, telling them to forget it and get back to the card game. But his friends wouldn't let it go. They were drunk and looking for some fun, and now they had a target. The goading turned into a dare. "You know what you should do, Anton? You should spend the night in that room. Tonight. Prove to us you're not afraid." At first, Anton refused. But his friends were relentless, and his drunken pride was on the line. He couldn't stand them thinking he was a coward in his own home. Finally, he slammed his hand on the table. "Fine," he declared. "I'll do it. I'll spend the night in there. I'll show you all it's just a stupid story." He probably assumed that by the time the party ended, everyone would be too drunk and tired to remember the dare. He figured he could just slip away to his own comfortable bedroom and no one would be the wiser. But his friends did not forget. When the card game finally wound down and it was time for everyone to go to bed, they all stood up and looked at Anton. "All right, Anton," one of them said with a grin. "Time to go to your new bedroom. We'll walk you up." Trapped by his own bravado, Anton had no choice but to lead the procession. The group of men, some stumbling, made their way out of the sitting room, up the grand staircase to the second floor, and down a long, dark hallway. They stopped in front of a heavy, ancient-looking wooden door. This was it. The forbidden room. Anton nervously fumbled with the old iron key he had retrieved. He put it in the lock and turned it. The mechanism groaned in protest, but it opened. Before pushing the door open, he turned to look at his friends one last time, a silent plea in his eyes. He was hoping they would let him off the hook. But they just stared back, their faces a mixture of curiosity and drunken amusement. They weren't backing down. "Go on," one of them urged. Anton sighed, turned back to the door, and pushed it open. He and his friends peered inside. For the first time, Anton laid eyes on the room he had avoided for so long. It was anticlimactic. It was just a bedroom, filled with old, heavy furniture that was covered in a thick layer of dust and draped with cobwebs. It looked like it hadn't been touched in 100 years. It was creepy, but it just looked like an old, unused room. "All right, get in there," his friend said, nudging him forward. Anton gave them a weak smile. "Okay, I'll see you all in the morning," he said, trying to sound confident. He stepped over the threshold into the dusty room. He then pulled the door shut behind him. His friends on the other side heard the distinct sound of the key turning in the lock. Anton was locking himself in for the night. Satisfied, his friends all walked back down the hall to their own guest rooms and went to sleep. Several hours later, in the dead of night, the silence of the castle was shattered. A terrible, blood-curdling scream ripped through the air. It was a sound of pure terror, and it was clearly coming from the haunted bedroom where Anton was sleeping. His friends were jolted awake. They scrambled out of their beds and ran into the hallway, their hearts pounding. They rushed down the hall to the locked door and started banging on it, yelling Anton's name. They tried the handle, but it was locked solid, just as he had left it. "Anton, are you okay?" "Open the door," they shouted. But there was no response. The screaming had stopped as abruptly as it had started. Now, there was only a dead, heavy silence coming from inside the room. A wave of dread washed over them. The drunken dare didn't seem so funny anymore. That scream had sounded real. It was the sound of someone in mortal danger. Something was terribly wrong. They had to get in there. They threw their shoulders against the heavy oak door, but it wouldn't budge. They took a few steps back and rammed it together, again and again. The old wood splintered and groaned until finally, with a loud crack, the door flew off its hinges and crashed into the room. They stumbled inside, their eyes frantically searching the darkness. And then they saw him. The sight that met them was one they would never forget. Anton was lying on the bed, flat on his back. His eyes were wide open, staring up at the ceiling with a look of unimaginable horror frozen on his face. He was dead. As they cautiously approached the bed, they saw the only sign of what might have happened to him. Around his neck, there was a thin, red line. It looked like a ligature mark, the kind of mark left by a rope or a wire. But there was no rope. There was no wire. There was nothing in the room that could have made such a mark. The windows were sealed shut from years of neglect. The door had been locked from the inside. There was no sign of a struggle. Nothing was out of place, except for Anton, lying dead on the bed with that inexplicable red line around his throat. The authorities were called, and they conducted a thorough investigation. They searched the room from top to bottom. They confirmed what the friends already knew: the room had been sealed from the inside. There was no way anyone could have gotten in or out. They never found any kind of rope, cord, or weapon that could have caused the mark on Anton's neck. An autopsy was performed, but the medical examiner was baffled. They couldn't determine a cause of death. He hadn't been poisoned, and there were no other injuries. He was just dead. The case was a complete mystery. But it becomes even stranger when you learn the full story of the hooded monk, not just the watered-down version Anton used to tell at parties. The complete legend, passed down for centuries, was much more specific. The story went that an evil monk had been executed in that very room hundreds of years ago, and his vengeful spirit remained, forever, trapped inside. The legend also contained a specific warning. If anyone dared to spend the night in that room, the ghost of the monk would appear and strangle them to death with a thin rope. The thin red mark found on Anton Holberg's neck was a perfect match for the legend's description. To this day, his death remains officially unexplained. A young man who died alone, in a locked room, seemingly at the hands of a ghost. Our final story takes us back to the very beginning of the 20th century, to southeastern Wales. Around 1 a.m. on Sunday, the 20th of January, 1907, a 57-year-old salt merchant named Samuel Hughes was dozing off on a passenger train. Sam was bone-tired. He had been working for nearly 24 hours straight. He had left his home in the small town of Blackwood early the previous morning and taken the train an hour south to the larger town of Newport, where he conducted most of his business. He had spent all of Saturday, from dawn until late into the night, meeting with clients and managing his accounts. Now, finally, he was on the last train home. He could barely keep his eyes open, his head lolling with the rhythm of the train. All he could think about was getting home, greeting his wife, and collapsing into his own warm bed. He had made this trip hundreds of times. He knew the route by heart. Even in his exhausted state, he could feel the train begin to slow down, and his body knew it was time. On autopilot, he gathered his bags, stood up, and shuffled out of his carriage and onto the platform. The train hissed and then pulled away, its red lights disappearing into the dark. Sam stood on the platform for a moment, waiting for the familiar sight of his local station. But, as his tired eyes adjusted, a cold dread washed over him. This wasn't his station. This wasn't Blackwood. In his exhausted stupor, he had gotten off the train one stop too early. He let out a groan of frustration. The train was gone. This was 1907. There wouldn't be another one until morning. He didn't have a phone to call a cab. He was stranded, in the middle of the night, in a town he didn't recognize. He had two choices. He could try to find an inn and spend the night, or he could try to walk home. He wasn't even sure how far away Blackwood was from here. First things first, he needed to find someone to ask for help. He stepped off the deserted platform and started walking towards a few faint lights he could see in the distance. He didn't have high hopes of finding anyone out and about at this hour, in what was clearly a very small rural town. But to his surprise, he hadn't walked for more than a few minutes when he saw another person approaching an intersection up ahead. As they got closer, he saw the uniform and realized it was a police officer on his nightly patrol. A wave of relief washed over Sam. He flagged the officer down. The officer was a bit suspicious at first, seeing a well-dressed man with luggage wandering around in the middle of the night. Sam quickly explained his foolish mistake, how he'd gotten off the train at the wrong stop. He asked the officer if there was a place to stay nearby, or if it was possible to walk to Blackwood. The officer was friendly and helpful. He told Sam that there were a couple of inns in town, but if he was feeling up to it, Blackwood was only about an hour's walk away. The officer said if it were him, he'd probably just make the walk and get home. Sam thought about it. As tired as he was, the thought of sleeping in his own bed was too tempting. He decided to walk. He asked the officer for directions. The officer explained that it was a straight shot. He just needed to follow the main road for about an hour. He would eventually come to a bridge. Once he crossed that bridge, he would see signs for Blackwood. It was simple. Sam thanked the officer profusely, picked up his bags, and set off down the dark road, heading for home. Several hours later, a little after 3 in the morning, Sam's wife Bess was wide awake in their home in Blackwood. She was sitting in a chair by the window, staring out into the darkness. She was worried. She knew Sam had a long day, but he should have been home by now. He was usually very predictable. For him to be this late without any word was highly unusual, and a knot of anxiety was tightening in her stomach. She sat there, listening to the old house creak and groan, her mind imagining all sorts of terrible things that could have happened. And then she heard it. It was Sam's voice, calling out her name from outside. Bess. "I'm home!" It sounded like he was just out front. He must have seen the lights on in the house and known she was waiting up for him. Bess was overcome with relief. He was safe. Her husband was home. She grabbed a candle, her hands trembling slightly, and hurried to the front door to let him in. She unlatched the door and pulled it open, a happy greeting on her lips. But the words died in her throat. It wasn't her husband. Sam was nowhere in sight. Instead, standing on her porch, just inches away from her, was a dark figure. It was tall and cloaked in black, and it was just standing there, silent and still, looking right at her. Bess froze. But strangely, she wasn't afraid. A bizarre sense of calm washed over her as she looked at this strange apparition. She didn't know what it was or what it wanted, but she felt no sense of threat. She just stood there, holding her candle, staring at the figure. And as she looked closer, she noticed a detail. On its head, the figure was wearing a black silk hat. Her husband Sam owned a hat just like it. In fact, he wore it almost every day. She knew for a fact he had been wearing it that morning when he left for Newport. She stared at this figure, wearing what looked like her husband's hat, and remembered hearing her husband's voice just moments before. She didn't imagine it. He had called to her. And then, Bess blinked. And in that instant, the figure was gone. It had simply vanished. The hat, the cloak, all of it. Her porch was empty. Now, the fear hit her. The calm was gone, replaced by a chilling terror. Had she imagined it all? What was happening? She thought maybe Sam was outside, hurt. Maybe he had called to her and then collapsed. She ran out of the house, holding her candle, and started searching the property, calling his name over and over. But Sam wasn't there. After a frantic search, she went back inside, her mind reeling. She sat up for a few more hours, waiting and watching, but Sam never came home. Eventually, exhausted and confused, she went to bed. When Bess woke up late the next afternoon, Sam still wasn't home. The bright sunlight made the strange vision from the night before seem even more unreal. She told herself she must have been half asleep, that she had dreamt the whole thing. Sam was fine, she reassured herself. He probably just got delayed in Newport and would be home soon. As she was trying to convince herself that everything was okay, she heard a sharp knock on the front door. For a moment, her heart leaped with hope. Maybe it was Sam. She rushed to the door and opened it. It was a police officer, the same one who had spoken to Sam the night before. He had a grim expression on his face, and he removed his helmet. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I have some terrible news." He explained what had happened. The night before, Sam had followed his directions, walking along the dark road towards Blackwood. He had made it all the way to the bridge that the officer had told him about. He was so close to home. But somehow, either because he was so exhausted or because it was so dark, he had made a fatal misstep. He had fallen from the bridge. His body had been discovered that morning. As Bess listened, her world collapsing around her, her mind inexplicably flashed back to the dark figure on her porch. Without thinking, she asked the officer a strange question. "What time do you think he died?" The officer paused, a bit taken aback, but then he answered. He said that based on when he had spoken to Sam and how long the walk to the bridge would have taken, they estimated that he likely fell sometime around 3 in the morning. The time was a perfect match. That was right around when she had heard Sam's voice and seen the figure. And then she thought of the hat. That distinct black silk hat. She had to know. Her voice was barely a whisper when she asked, "When you found him, was he wearing his hat?" The officer looked confused by the question, but answered it. "No, ma'am," he said. "He wasn't wearing a hat at all. We couldn't find one at the scene." In that moment, Bess knew. As heartbreaking as it was, she knew exactly what she had seen on her porch. It hadn't been a dream or a figment of her imagination. Who or what she saw, the dark figure in the cloak wearing her husband's black silk hat, had been Sam's spirit. He had fallen from the bridge and died, and his soul had come home one last time to say goodbye. The figure wearing his hat was his way of letting her know it was really him. Bess would go on to tell her story to a local reporter, and the tale of the ghostly goodbye was printed in newspapers all across Wales, a haunting reminder that sometimes love is strong enough to cross even the final boundary between life and death. The strange thing about stories like these is that no matter how much evidence you uncover, one piece never seems to fit. A ghost seen at the exact moment of death. A locked room with no escape. A figure returning home after falling into darkness. Maybe some mysteries were never meant to be solved. Thanks for watching, and if you're brave enough for one more story tonight, there's a playlist waiting for you right now. Until next time. On the afternoon of the 10th of April, 1998, a 40-year-old woman named Diane Auget stood at a bar inside the Hayloft Tavern. It was a small local spot in Hudson, Florida. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, or at least they think they do. Diane held a glass in her hand. She brought it to her lips and downed the last few sips of her drink. Her vision was starting to get blurry, and a wave of nausea rolled through her stomach. But she didn't care. In fact, that was kind of the point. She yelled out to the bartender, her voice slurred and thick, telling him to bring her another round. She wanted to get so drunk that she could forget everything. Because right then, her life felt like a complete disaster. It hadn't always been this way. Not too long ago, Diane had been a married stay-at-home mother. She had 3 kids, and they were her entire world. She loved them more than anything. But about 10 years before this night at the bar, her life had taken a very difficult turn. She started having very serious mental health problems. After a long and difficult process, she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. It was a heavy diagnosis, one that came with a whole new set of challenges. She would fall into these deep, dark depressions. They were so powerful, they would make it almost impossible for her to function, to even get out of bed in the morning. Then, like a switch would flip, she would swing into these intense manic episodes. These would keep her awake for days on end, leaving her so delirious and exhausted that she would start talking to herself, seeing things that weren't there. Living with this was incredibly hard, not just for Diane, but for her family. Eventually, the strain became too much. Her husband divorced her, and in the custody battle that followed, he was awarded full custody of their children. Losing her kids, even if she understood why, was a blow that Diane never fully recovered from. By 1998, her life had sort of leveled off into a new, difficult normal. She was living with her sister, which provided some support and a roof over her head. But her bipolar disorder was far from under control. She had medication for it, but she wasn't always consistent about taking it. So, the cycles continued. The crushing lows of depression, followed by the chaotic highs of mania. She had been in and out of various psychiatric facilities more times than her family could count. Each time, they hoped it would be the one that finally helped her find stability. But it never seemed to stick. So, on this particular night, April 10th, Diane was in a dark place. She just wanted to numb the pain, to drown her sorrows, and make the world go quiet for a little while. A couple of hours earlier, she had left her sister's house. She didn't say where she was going. She didn't own a car, so she just started walking. Her feet eventually carried her to the Hayloft Tavern. And for the past couple of hours, she had been standing there, mostly by herself, pacing in circles and drinking alone. Just then, the bartender came back over to her side of the bar. Diane was seeing double, but she could clearly see that he wasn't carrying another drink for her. His hands were empty. He had a look on his face that was half annoyed, half sympathetic. He told her he was cutting her off, that she'd had enough. Diane was furious. The feeling of humiliation washed over her. She started to argue with him, telling him he didn't know what he was talking about, that she was fine. But the bartender just held up his hands and stood his ground. He was sorry, he said, but she was cut off. There was a finality in his voice. Defeated and angry, Diane turned and stumbled out of the bar, disappearing into the Florida night. The next day, April 11th, Diane's mother, Mildred, was pacing back and forth inside her living room. She held a phone pressed tightly to her ear, listening to it ring. After a couple of rings, a dispatcher from the local police department answered. In a shaky voice, Mildred told them she needed to report her daughter, Diane, as a missing person. A little while earlier, Mildred had gotten a call from her other daughter, the one Diane was living with. She said that Diane had left the house the night before and still hadn't come home. She hadn't called, hadn't left a note, nothing. Given Diane's history of mental illness and her often erratic behavior, Mildred's mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario. She felt a deep, cold pit of fear in her stomach. Her daughter had to be in some kind of trouble. On the phone with the police dispatcher, Mildred explained the whole situation. She said that yes, it was possible that Diane had just left on her own for some reason. But it was just as possible, if not more so, that she was having a manic episode. When that happened, Diane could become disoriented. She might have wandered off and gotten lost, with no idea how to get back home. The dispatcher was calm and professional. She assured Mildred that she would send officers to interview her and her other daughter right away. They would start looking for Diane immediately. But 4 days went by. 4 long, agonizing days. And on April 15th, there was still no sign of Diane. That afternoon, Mildred went down to the police station. It was a trip she had made every single day since her daughter had disappeared, hoping for any scrap of news. But just like all the other days, the police didn't have any new information for her. They told her what little they knew, which wasn't much. They had confirmed that on the night of April 10th, after leaving her sister's house, Diane had gone to the Hayloft Tavern. They spoke to the bartender, who confirmed he had cut her off because she was incredibly drunk. He said she had walked out of the bar, and that was the last he saw of her. Investigators had also found a couple of people who had seen Diane the following day, on April 11th. She had been sighted walking along Highway 19, which was just a couple of miles away from the tavern. Another witness spotted her near a locally owned motel right off the highway, a place called the Coral Sands Motel. But after that, the trail went cold. The police told Mildred they had no idea what happened to Diane after that. They didn't know where she could have gone or what could have happened to her. Mildred left the police station feeling a profound sense of disappointment and fear. The drive home was a blur. Her mind was racing, playing out all the terrible possibilities. Was her daughter hiding somewhere on purpose? Had she gotten lost and was now hurt, hungry, and alone? Or had she run into the wrong person? Had she been kidnapped? Or worse? These scenarios tormented her, each one more terrifying than the last. Finally, she pulled into her driveway and went inside. She sat down on her couch, exhausted, and tried to think about what she could possibly do next. And that's when she noticed it. The little red light on her answering machine was blinking. She had a new voicemail. Mildred thought maybe it was her other daughter, calling with an update while she was out. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something to do with Diane. She got up, walked over to the machine, and pressed the play button. What she heard next made her blood run cold. It was Diane's voice, and she sounded absolutely terrified. Through the static of the machine, Mildred could hear her daughter crying out, "Help! Let me out!" Then there was a scuffling sound on the recording, like someone had grabbed the phone away from Diane. Mildred heard Diane say something like, "Hey, give me that," and then the call just cut off. The line went dead. After hearing the message, Mildred went into a total panic. Her worst fears were no longer just possibilities in her head. They felt real. It sounded like her daughter was in terrible immediate danger. Shaking with anxiety and fear, she grabbed the answering machine and looked at the small display for the caller ID, desperate to see who had left this horrifying message. But all it said was that the call had come in from a place called Starlight. The name meant nothing to Mildred. She quickly dialed the number back, her heart pounding in her chest, praying that someone would pick up. But no one answered. The phone just rang and rang. With trembling hands, Mildred called the police. This voicemail changed everything. It was now obvious to the police that Diane hadn't just left on purpose, and she wasn't just lost. Based on that recording, it sounded like she had been kidnapped and was being held somewhere against her will. But the question was, where? The police had no idea. They tried to trace the call, but they couldn't pinpoint a specific location. And they couldn't figure out what Starlight was either. Was it a business? A nickname for a location? They had no leads. So, for another full day, despite this terrifying new clue, the investigation stalled. There just wasn't much to go on. That is, until the next afternoon. On April 16th, 5 days after Diane had disappeared, the police got a call. It was from a man who said he had just been walking along the side of Highway 19. He told the dispatcher he had found something disturbing lying in the grass. He said he wasn't even sure if the object was real, but it looked so troubling that he thought the police should come and check it out, just in case. Police immediately rushed out to the location. They met the man, who showed them what he had found. The officers carefully collected the object and sent it off to the crime lab for testing. Then they waited. When the analysis came back, they learned two things. First, the object was definitely real. And second, it belonged to Diane Augat. It was the severed tip of her finger from her right hand. Over the next few years, the case of Diane Augat grew colder but stranger. People would occasionally call in sightings of her to the police in Florida. Investigators looked into every single tip. They interviewed more than 100 people, chasing down every possible lead. But nothing ever panned out. The police never figured out what Starlight was, the mysterious place where that desperate voicemail had originated. And they never determined how or why Diane's finger was cut off and left by the side of the highway. But despite the lack of answers, strange clues that were definitely tied to Diane kept turning up in the most bizarre places. For example, the manager of a convenience store near where Diane lived found a plastic bag inside their store's outdoor freezer. Inside the bag were Diane's clothes, all neatly folded. Who would put them there, and why? Another time, a customer at a different nearby convenience store found another plastic bag that had been left behind on a countertop. This bag was full of toiletries, including eyeliner, perfume, and lipstick. And on the outside of the bag, scrawled in marker, was the name Diane. Police were never able to figure out who placed either of the bags or what they were supposed to mean. Unfortunately, today, more than 2 decades later, Diane's case remains unsolved. Her family has never stopped looking for answers. Around 3:30 inches the afternoon on the 17th of December, 1927, a 21-year-old sailor named Joe Stevens stood inside a U.S. Navy submarine. The vessel was cruising silently underwater in Cape Cod Bay, about a mile off the coast of Massachusetts. Joe was at the very front of the submarine, stationed inside a small, windowless compartment known as the torpedo room. It was about 20 feet long and 10 feet wide. On one side, a heavy metal door stood open, leading out to the rest of the sub. The walls of the room were lined with 6 bunks for the crew, a tangled mess of machinery, and several long, menacing torpedoes. Despite the cramped and dark conditions, Joe was absolutely thrilled to be there. Working on a submarine had been his dream for as long as he could remember. When he was just a little kid, he had actually built his own periscope out of a piece of wood. A periscope on a real submarine is like a long set of binoculars that can be raised up from the sub. It allows the crew to be just below the surface of the water, hidden from view, while the periscope pokes just barely out of the water to see what's going on around them. With this fake wooden periscope, Joe and his older sister, Florence, would spend hours and hours pretending they were on a submarine deep underwater, going on all sorts of secret and important missions. So, years later, when Joe turned 18, remember, the very first thing he did was enlist in the Navy. And just recently, he had finally been assigned to work on this exact submarine. For Joe, it was literally his childhood dream coming true. On this particular day, Joe was taking part in one of his very first test sails. The mission was simple. He and the other 40 men on board were just running through drills, testing all the different machinery to make sure everything was in perfect working order. Joe and 5 other men had been assigned to the torpedo room. They were standing by, waiting for a command from their captain to come through on the one-way intercom system overhead. But as they were standing there, waiting in the quiet hum of the submarine, something happened. Out of nowhere, Joe heard a loud, grating, metallic sound. It echoed through the entire submarine, a horrible screech of metal against metal. The sub itself shook so violently from the impact that Joe and the other men were thrown off their feet, falling hard to the metal floor. Immediately, Joe and his coworkers scrambled to get up. They looked at each other with wide, confused eyes, all thinking the same thing. What was that? But before they could even say a word, their worst nightmare began to unfold. A torrent of seawater began to rush through that open door, flooding in from the rest of the submarine and into the torpedo room. As this absolutely horrifying scenario was playing out, Joe's immediate reaction was a strange and overwhelming sense of déjà vu. For just a split second, he felt like he had experienced this exact moment before. But before he could even process that bizarre feeling, a couple of his coworkers rushed past him. They managed to get to the door that connected the torpedo room to the rest of the submarine, and with all their strength, they slammed it shut and sealed it tight. At that point, Joe was snapped back to reality. He wasn't thinking about the feeling of déjà vu anymore. He was focused on what was happening. He realized there must have been some kind of terrible accident. Everyone in the room thought the same thing. That horrible grating sound, the shaking, the rushing water, it could only mean one thing. Something had struck their submarine. He expected to hear the captain's voice come over the intercom at any second, not to continue the test run, but with urgent orders about what they should do now that a real-world emergency was happening. And so, for a couple of minutes, Joe and his 5 fellow sailors just sat there in the now sealed-off torpedo room, waiting in silence for that announcement. But there was nothing. Just the sound of their own breathing and the faint creaks of the submarine. And then they all felt a final, heavy jolt, as if the entire submarine had just settled at the bottom of the bay. At first, Joe and the 5 other sailors didn't panic. They knew that whatever had happened was not good. It was serious. But they figured it wasn't a total catastrophe just yet. It was bad, but maybe they could be saved. After all, they were only about a mile away from the nearest Coast Guard station. And even though Joe and the others inside the torpedo room had no way to communicate with the outside world from where they were, they assumed that someone in the other parts of the submarine would be able to send out a distress call to the Coast Guard. They figured help was already on its way. But the minutes slowly turned into hours. And there was no progress. There was no sign that any sort of rescue was underway. They heard nothing over the intercom. They couldn't even hear any sounds from the other side of the sealed door. They thought that by now, surely one of their comrades would have come over and knocked or tried to talk to them in some way. But there was only silence. To make matters worse, the emergency lights inside the torpedo room eventually flickered and died, plunging them into total darkness. They were trapped at the bottom of the bay in a sealed metal room with no light. They also had no food and no water. All the supplies were in the other part of the submarine, but they couldn't risk opening the door. More water could come rushing in. They were completely and utterly trapped. All of that was horrible, but the scariest part of the whole situation was something they all knew but didn't want to say out loud. There was a finite amount of oxygen inside that sealed room. And with every single breath they took, they were using up that precious air supply. Pretty soon, that tiny metal torpedo room started to feel less like a part of a submarine and more like an underwater coffin. Joe began fading in and out of sleep. He lost all track of time in the endless dark. And with each passing hour, he was starting to lose hope. But then, suddenly, Joe heard a sound. It was a loud, metallic, clanging sound. He realized someone was knocking on the outside of the submarine. Their rescue had begun. Joe and the others immediately jumped out of their bunks, knocking into each other in the pitch-black room. They scrambled over to the hull of the sub and began knocking back, signaling to whoever was out there that they were alive. They were still in there. By using Morse code, which is a method of communication that uses a series of taps, Joe was able to have a conversation with the people outside. He confirmed that they were Coast Guard rescue divers. And they told Joe what had happened. They explained that about 16 hours earlier, a Coast Guard ship had accidentally struck their submarine. The collision had punctured the hull, and the submarine had sunk to the bottom. Everyone else on board, besides Joe and the 5 men with him in the torpedo room, had drowned. When Joe and the others heard this news, it was horrifying. But at the same time, they were hit with a wave of relief. Had they not sealed that door as fast as they did, they would be dead too. They were so incredibly lucky to be alive. So, after hearing this message, Joe began frantically knocking back a new message. He basically said, well, that's great, but when are you going to get us out of here? He explained that they were running out of air, that it was getting harder and harder to breathe. But the rescue divers could only tell him that they were doing their best. They would get them up as soon as they possibly could. And this was true. The Coast Guard was genuinely doing everything they could to save them. But the reality was, this was a really, really difficult problem. You have 6 people trapped inside a small air pocket deep underwater. If you try to open any part of the submarine, the immense pressure of the ocean would cause water to rush in so quickly that it would kill everyone inside instantly. So that wasn't an option. You also had the ticking clock. As Joe had said, they were running out of air. This meant there was a very compressed timeline to figure this out. So really, the only option was to somehow lift the entire submarine with everyone still inside and raise it to the surface. But this was 1927. This would be a complicated thing to do even with modern technology, let alone nearly 100 years ago. But it was their best and only chance. The plan was to bring in multiple ships with different kinds of heavy-duty lifts and somehow scoop up the submarine and bring it to the surface before everyone inside suffocated. But there was another problem. Just as they began to organize all these ships, a huge storm rolled in. The surface of the ocean was now being battered by extremely high winds, making it nearly impossible to position the ships and their lifting equipment. And unfortunately, the weather forecast said this storm was going to rage for days. While this catastrophe was playing out off the coast of Massachusetts, about 100 miles away in Providence, Rhode Island, Joe's older sister, Florence, opened up a newspaper. She read yet another article about the sunken submarine where she knew her little brother was trapped. For the last couple of days, Florence had been absolutely glued to her radio and the newspapers, desperate for any piece of good news. But every article, every news segment, said the same thing. The 6 men trapped inside the sub were still alive. They were communicating with the divers. But the storm on the surface was still too intense to rescue them. Florence felt so scared for her brother, and it wasn't just because the situation itself was so dangerous. It was because she remembered the submarine game that she and Joe used to play when they were little. More specifically, she remembered the very last time they ever played it. Joe had been about 4 years old. The two of them had just finished another one of their make-believe missions, and they were supposed to be bringing their imaginary submarine back up to the surface. But then, Joe had suddenly dropped his homemade wooden periscope. He turned to Florence and said something so strange and so haunting for such a young child that Florence had never forgotten it. She had asked him to explain what he meant, but he had refused. In fact, after that day, he refused to play the submarine game ever again. Now, Florence hadn't thought about that strange moment in years. But now, seeing what was happening to her brother, it was all she could think about. A couple of days later, on December 22nd, 5 days after the submarine had sunk, Florence received the official word. Her brother Joe and all the other sailors trapped in the torpedo room had died while waiting to be rescued. Florence was completely grief-stricken. This was her baby brother, and he had just died in this horrible, drawn-out way. But also, strangely, for the first time in her life, she felt like she actually understood what Joe had said all those years ago when he was just 4 years old when they had played that last game of submarine. On that day, after dropping his periscope, he had turned to Florence and said, quote, "All hands were lost." It's an expression used in the Navy to mean that everybody on board a ship has died. He was saying their make-believe submarine had just sunk, and everyone on board had died. And remember, after he said this, Florence had tried to get 4-year-old Joe to explain, but he wouldn't. And he never played the game again. So now, in hindsight, Florence believed that her 4-year-old brother, all those years ago, had somehow predicted his own death. On the evening of the 19th of April, 1989, a 62-year-old man named Thomas Meehan was sitting in his living room in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was relaxing, watching some television, when his phone rang. Thomas picked it up and said hello. He heard the voice of his daughter Patricia on the other end of the line. And right away he could tell from the tone of her voice that she was feeling really down. This didn't really surprise him. Patricia was 37 years old, and Thomas knew she had been struggling a lot lately. She lived almost 2,000 miles away from him in Bozeman, Montana, where she worked as a ranch hand. She liked her job, for the most part, mainly because she absolutely loved animals. But she had a really hard time getting along with people. She was lonely. She didn't have a lot of close friends. On top of that, she had recently been through a tough breakup. And even though she had always wanted kids, she had never had any of her own. To her father, it seemed like his daughter was going through a classic midlife crisis. So, as Thomas was on the phone, listening to his daughter make small talk about her life, he decided to cut through it. He just asked her, "Hey, what's going on? How are you really doing?" Patricia paused for a moment. Then, she vaguely said that she was just under a lot of stress. She told him she was thinking about quitting her job and moving away from Bozeman. She then asked her dad if he would be okay with her coming to Pittsburgh, maybe moving back in with him for a while. Thomas adored his daughter, and he felt for everything she was going through. So, without a moment's hesitation, he told her, of course. Of course she could come home anytime she wanted. Hearing this definitely seemed to lighten Patricia's mood. She told her dad that she would call him back the next day to make more solid plans. And then she said she loved him, and she hung up the phone. But the next day, Thomas did not get a call from Patricia. In fact, he never got another call from his daughter ever again. The following day, April 20th, at about 8:15 inches the evening, something strange happened 1,500 miles away from Thomas's house in Pittsburgh. A woman named Carol Heights was driving down a very isolated two-lane highway in the rural town of Circle, Montana. It was dark and cold outside. The only thing Carol could see was the red taillights of the one car driving in front of her. Beyond that, on either side of the highway, there was just big, empty fields stretching out into the darkness. But then, out of nowhere, the car in front of her, which had been driving along at a steady speed, suddenly swerved off the road. For a second, Carol was just confused. Why would they do that? What caused that car to suddenly veer out of the way? But then, a split second later, Carol understood exactly what had happened. Because right in front of her, in her lane, was another car driving the wrong way, barreling straight towards her. Carol jammed on her brakes and tried to swerve out of the way, just like the car in front of her had done. But she wasn't fast enough. The other car smashed into her, basically head-on. Carol felt her head snap back against the seat. There was a deafening, metallic crunching sound, and then everything went black. Just a couple of minutes later, Carol opened her eyes. She realized she had survived the crash. She felt a sharp pain in her neck, and her car was a complete mess. The airbags had deployed. It was obvious she'd been in a very serious wreck, but she was alive. Eventually, Carol managed to push her door open and climb out of the car. Her first thought was to check on the other driver. The other car was smashed right up against hers, and she couldn't see if the person inside was okay. So she got out and started walking over to the other vehicle. But before she could reach it, the driver of the other car also climbed out. In the combined glare of both cars' headlights, Carol could see that the other person was a middle-aged woman. She appeared to have shoulder-length strawberry blonde hair. And this woman, she didn't seem to be hurt, at least not visibly. In fact, what was really weird was that she seemed very, very calm. This woman just stood there by her wrecked car, not saying a single word to Carol. She didn't acknowledge what she had just done, which was drive the wrong way down a highway and smash head-on into Carol's car, nearly killing her. There was no recognition of that at all. Instead, she just stood there. And then, eventually, she turned and just stared directly at Carol. This was starting to get very alarming for Carol. It caused her to stop in her tracks and just stand there as well, staring back at this woman, not really sure what to do or say. And as Carol was waiting to see what would happen next, the other driver, this middle-aged woman, simply turned and started walking away. At this point, Carol yelled out to her to stop. She shouted that she couldn't go, that they had just been in a horrible accident, and they had to wait for the police to get there. She couldn't just leave the scene. But the woman didn't even look back. She just calmly walked off the highway, climbed over a wire fence into one of those big empty fields on the side of the road, and just kept on walking until Carol couldn't see her anymore. She had just vanished into the darkness. When the police arrived about 45 minutes later at 9 p.m., they found the two wrecked cars and a very shaken Carol. The other driver, as Carol explained, was gone. So the police ran the license plate of the car that had hit Carol's. They learned that it was registered to a 37-year-old woman named Patricia Meehan. But beyond the fact that Patricia had apparently just walked away from the crash, the other weird thing was that the registration showed she lived 400 miles away. The police had no idea what she was even doing all the way out here in Circle, Montana. Patricia did not come back to the crash site. So eventually, the police called in K-9 units, and they began searching for her. The dogs were able to pick up her trail. They found a line of her footprints leading out into that dark field. They followed that trail for hours and hours, deep into the empty landscape. But eventually, the footprints just stopped, and the dogs lost her scent. The police would continue looking for her, but they never found another trace of Patricia. It really was like she had just wandered into that field and vanished into thin air. But that was not the end of the story. About 2 weeks later, a totally unrelated police officer was eating at a fast food restaurant in Luverne, Minnesota. This was about 700 miles away from the crash site. Now, even though this officer lived and worked in a completely different state, he had actually heard about Patricia Meehan's disappearance. He'd seen pictures of her, because by this point, her case had become national news. So, when this officer looked across the restaurant he was in and saw a middle-aged woman with strawberry blonde hair sitting in a booth all by herself, silently drinking a glass of water and just staring off into space, he immediately thought it was Patricia. The police officer had no idea if this really was her. He was pretty confident it was, but it just seemed so random and so bizarre that she would be here, of all places. He also didn't know if she was alone or what she was doing. So, instead of getting up and talking to her, he decided to just stay in his seat and keep an eye on her. And for the next 5 hours, the woman he believed was Patricia just sat there in the booth. She slowly drank water and stared off into space for 5 straight hours. Eventually, the restaurant closed for the night. An employee had to go over and tell the woman that she had to leave. They also told the officer that he too had to go. So, after the officer and the woman he thought was Patricia had left the restaurant, the officer kind of hung back and continued to watch her. And she just walked right across the street and went into a diner that was open all night. This time, the officer did not keep his distance. He went inside the diner, walked right over to where she was sitting at a table, and he sat down next to her. He just said, "What's your name?" For a moment, the woman seemed kind of confused, like she couldn't understand why a random police officer was sitting with her. But instead of challenging him, she just went quiet for a second. And then, in a sort of hushed voice, she said that she was from Colorado. But then a moment later, she shook her head and said, "Actually, no. I'm from Israel." And before she could give up any more information, like her name or why she was there, she suddenly jumped up out of her seat and ran outside. The police officer was caught off guard. He was a little slow to get up and chase after her. He ran outside too, but by the time he got out there, she had disappeared again. Over the next month or so, the police in charge of Patricia's case received dozens of reports just like this one. They came from people who believed they had seen Patricia at restaurants and truck stops all over America. And the police actually confirmed many of these sightings. They believed that these witnesses really did see Patricia, that it wasn't just some look-alike. And in every single case, the witnesses reported the same thing. This woman, presumably Patricia, refused to speak and was just staring vacantly into space. She didn't seem to know who she was or what she was even doing. But also, in every one of these cases, before anybody could intervene or ask her questions or just try to help her in some way, Patricia would run off and disappear again. It was like Patricia was a ghost, appearing and disappearing over and over again all across the country. As of today, there have been over 5,000 reported sightings of Patricia Meehan. But still, we do not know where she is. Her case, to this day, is still open and unsolved. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. 3 nights in a row, something walked through that cabin. Every night at almost exactly 3 in the morning, I would hear footsteps crossing the wooden porch outside my room. Then the front door would creak open. The sleigh bells hanging from it would start ringing. A metal pot in the kitchen would crash onto the floor. And then the footsteps would begin moving through the house toward us. The terrifying part wasn't the sound. It was the fact that whoever or whatever was making those footsteps should not have existed, because when it finally entered our room, the thing standing in the darkness was impossibly tall. Its legs were so unnaturally long that its waist sat higher than a normal person's head. And on 2 separate nights, I watched it walk past my bed, lean over my sleeping friend, and disappear straight down into the floor beneath him. What happened in that cabin completely changed my life. I never went back there again. And to this day, I still don't know whether we experienced a ghost or something much worse. But to understand how any of this happened, we need to go back to the winter when I was 16 years old. When I was 16 years old, my life pretty much revolved around snowboarding. I had started when I was about 12, and it just became my thing. My entire world during the winter months was about finding the next good snow, the next chance to get on the mountain. And I always did it with the same two people, my best friends, Wolf and Nick. Every single winter, without fail, the three of us would pack our gear and head up to Nick's family cabin in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. It was our ritual. We'd spend a few days just completely immersed in snowboarding, from sunup to sundown. It was perfect. The trips were always the same little group. It would be me, Wolf, and Nick, and then Nick's mom and dad would come along too. Nick's dad was a great guy, always had a story to tell, and he was a big part of the whole experience. But then, leading into the winter when I was 16, something happened that changed everything. Unexpectedly, Nick's father passed away. It was a huge shock to everyone. We were in the middle of planning our annual trip to the mountains when we got the news. I remember talking to Wolf on the phone, and we were both just lost. I told him, I don't even know if it's appropriate to ask about the trip anymore. It felt so trivial, so unimportant in the face of what had happened. We all knew how incredibly close Nick was to his dad. And big on that, Nick's dad was always there with us on these trips. He was part of the fabric of the whole thing. The drive up, the evenings at the cabin, it just seemed impossible to imagine doing it without him. The dynamic would be completely broken. A little while later, we got a call from Nick. He said, hey, so we are still going to do the snowboarding trip to the cabin in New Hampshire. Wolf and I talked about it afterwards. We were hesitant, but we figured we should just go with it. Our thinking was that maybe this was something they needed. Maybe they wanted to be surrounded by a fond memory of their husband and father. Maybe doing something that he loved in a place that he loved was their way of grieving and remembering. So we agreed to go. His dad had passed away a few months before the trip, so the grief was still very fresh, very raw. You could feel it. And like we had predicted, the dynamic was completely different. It was like there was this giant elephant in the room that no one wanted to talk about. As we were driving up in the car, just me, Wolf, Nick, and his mom driving, the absence of his dad was so apparent. He always sat in the passenger seat, and now it was just empty. The usual chatter and jokes were replaced by long stretches of quiet. It was heavy. So we finally make the long drive up to New Hampshire, planning to stay for 3 days. The place itself wasn't really a house, it was a true cabin. It was a small wooden house built on the side of a mountain. Now, if you think about how a mountain is shaped, it's a slope. So to build a level house on it, you have to get creative. A portion of the house has to be built up on these tall stilts, the part that hangs off the edge of the mountain. And the other part of the house is sort of dug into the mountainside itself. When you drive up the long, winding driveway, you see this wraparound porch that goes around most of the house. The majority of that porch is on the stilted section. So, when you walk on it, your footsteps really echo. You can hear every single step clear as day because you're walking on this hollow, suspended structure. When you get to the front door, it opens inwardly. And on the inside of the door, Nick's mom had hung a string of old-fashioned sleigh bells. So anytime the door opened, you'd hear this distinct, festive chiming sound. As soon as you step inside the house, the layout is very specific. If you took just one step in, your right foot would land on the linoleum of the kitchen floor. Your left foot would land on the old shag carpet of the dining room. That's just how it was set up. Kitchen immediately to your right, dining room to your left. If you kept walking straight, you'd enter the main living room. This room had a high ceiling, and if you turned around and looked up, you'd see a lofted second floor that overlooked the whole space. Now, if you were to walk into the house with the kitchen on your right and the dining room on your left, and you walked about halfway across the house before reaching the living room, you could look to your right and see a single hallway. It was the only hallway in the whole place. It was a very small cabin. This hallway led you deeper into the mountain, into the section of the house that was built right into the earth. If you went down this short hallway, it took a sharp left turn, and that led you to one single room at the end. And that room was our room. It's where me, Nick, and Wolf would always stay every time we came up to snowboard. The room itself was a corner room, and it was packed. You'd open the door, and immediately to your right was a bunk bed. I always slept on the bottom bunk, and Wolf always took the top. Our feet would be closest to the door. In the remaining space in the center of the room, which wasn't much, there was a queen-size bed. It was slightly larger than our bunks, and it took up basically all the free space that was left. That's where Nick slept. The room was so full of these 3 beds that there wasn't much room for anything else. There was a very narrow little aisle, a small space between the queen-size bed and the bunk bed, just wide enough for a person to walk through. But that was it. This layout, the position of the beds, and that little walkway is very important. You'll see why in a minute. So, we snowboard for the first day. It's great to be back on the mountain, and for a little while, we can almost forget about the sadness hanging over the trip. We get back to the cabin, exhausted and happy, and the 3 of us decide we're going to crash super early. The plan was to get up before dawn and have a full day of riding ahead of us. We were hardcore snowboarders, and we wanted to get the first tracks on the fresh powder. So we all go to our room, the one at the end of the hallway. Our plan was to go to bed early, but we were teenagers, and we were excited to be there, so we stayed up for a while playing video games. Finally, maybe around 11 or 12 o'clock at night, Nick, who was in the queen bed, and Wolf in the top bunk, both fall fast asleep. I, however, was still wide awake. And something struck me, something that always struck me whenever I slept in this particular room. When you turn off all the lights and all the electronics, when you're just lying there in the dark, it is absolutely pitch black. There are no windows in this room. Remember, you're in the part of the house that's literally built inside the mountain. It is true, sensory-depriving darkness. Not only that, but the cabin itself was incredibly isolated. There weren't really any neighbors nearby. Nick's family had bought this place a long time ago, back when the mountain it was on used to be an active ski resort. But the resort had shut down years ago. Most of the people who lived there had sold their properties and left. But a few families, like Nick's, decided to stay. So they had this cabin on what was essentially an abandoned ski resort. There were virtually no streetlights, almost no other houses, and at night, when you're lying in that room like I was, you were just struck by how profoundly dark and quiet it is. There's no white noise, no cars, no distant sirens. Just pure, unbroken silence and pitch black darkness. So I'm lying there, and there's one other detail that's important before we get into what happened. Nick had 2 much older brothers. They were in their 30s while we were just 16. And we were expecting one of them, we didn't know which one, to swing by the house at some point over the next few days. Nick's mom had mentioned it, and Nick had kind of reiterated it. Wolf and I understood the reasoning. Now that Nick's father was gone, the family was trying to find ways to fill that huge void. Having an older brother come and be there with them made sense. So we were expecting one of them to show up. The thing is, I had never actually met either of these 2 brothers. I knew they existed, of course, but our paths had never crossed. But still, somewhere in the back of my mind, I had this little piece of information. One of Nick's brothers is probably going to show up at some point. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow, but sometime soon. That night, as I'm lying in bed just thinking about how dark and quiet everything is, I'm staring into the blackness. The only light in the entire room was the faint red glow of a little digital clock on the nightstand. It was like a tiny beacon in an ocean of darkness. It doesn't give off much light, but when it's pure black, it's all you can see. And I just could not fall asleep. I remember I got to that frustrating place where you start counting how many hours of sleep you might get if you fell asleep right then and there. It's never a good sign. If you're calculating that you have 3 hours and 22 minutes of potential sleep left, you're not even close to sleeping. That's where my head was at. At some point, I remember looking at the clock and seeing that it was around 3 in the morning. I was thinking, wow, it's gotten so late, and I'm still wide awake. And that's when I hear it. Footsteps. On the wraparound porch. Now, in a situation like this, as I'm telling it, you're probably thinking, how did a red flag not go up immediately? But in real time, in real life, your brain goes to incredible lengths to convince you that everything is okay. It tries to rationalize things, to find a logical explanation. It takes an enormous amount of strange, stacked up anomalies for your brain to finally admit that something is wrong. And that's exactly what happened on this first night. I hear footsteps on the wraparound porch, and my mind immediately jumps to a conclusion. Even though it's 3 o'clock in the morning, I just assume that it has to be one of Nick's brothers arriving. He's finally here to be part of the weekend getaway. So, honestly, I didn't think anything of it. I wasn't scared at all. I just thought, well, when he comes into the house, if he happens to come in here to check on us, I'll just pretend to be asleep. That way, I don't have to have a conversation with him. For one, it's 3 in the morning. And for two, I don't even know the guy. It would be awkward. So I'll just fake being asleep. That's my whole plan. I'm not worried, not scared, not anything. Just footsteps on the porch. Then the front door opens. And I can clearly hear the sleigh bells that are hanging on the door. I hear them chime as the door swings open. Again, no part of me is concerned. I'm still thinking, it's a little weird that he's arriving at 3 in the morning, but we knew his brothers had strange work schedules. Nick's mom had said they might show up in the middle of the night. So it was weird, but it was explainable. It was whatever. The sleigh bells ring, and then I hear a loud clang. It sounds like a metal pot, like a kitchen pot, falling off a counter and hitting the hard linoleum floor in the kitchen. I remember that sound really stood out to me. It seemed like this person was making a bit of a commotion for the middle of the night. And then I noticed something else. The door didn't shut. The front door was still open. I figured maybe he was bringing his bags in, unloading some stuff from his car, so he just left the door open for a moment. But it stayed open. As I'm lying there just thinking about this, it's starting to make me feel a little uncomfortable. So I hear the footsteps on the wraparound porch, the door opens, I hear the sleigh bells, a pot falls and hits the floor. And then the footsteps continue. The footsteps that I could hear so clearly on the wraparound porch, because the porch is on stilts, it's hovering over the ground, so the sound echoes. Well, when these footsteps moved from the porch into the house, they didn't change. They still had that same hollow, echoing quality as if they were walking on suspended wooden plank. But they were inside the house now on a concrete slab foundation. There should be no echoing sound. I shouldn't be hearing footsteps with that same resonance. But I was. The sound of the footsteps was getting closer to me, and it sounded totally natural when it was outside, but once it was inside the house, it just didn't make any sense. I'm hearing these strange footsteps, the front door is still wide open, and we're in the middle of winter in the mountains. It's freezing outside. And I'm thinking about that, but my brain is still clinging to the idea that it has to be Nick's brother. The footsteps continue through the kitchen and dining area, and then they stop about halfway through the house, right at the entrance to the hallway that leads to our room. And then the footsteps begin to walk down that hallway towards us. They come all the way down the hall, and they stop right outside our door, which is shut. I'm lying there, remember my feet are closest to the door, and it's pitch black in the room except for that little red clock. And I'm thinking, why didn't he shut the front door? Of all the weird things that have happened so far, the fact that I'm hearing these impossible footsteps moving through the house, the thing that really just made the hair on the back of my neck stand up was, why didn't they shut the front door? That just seems like such a bad idea. There are animals out there. There's a host of things out there, not to mention it's freezing cold. Why would you not shut the door? My bed is positioned in a way that there's a space between the bottom bunk, where I am, and the top bunk above me. It creates a sort of horizontal slit that I can see through. I have a clear view of the doorway, so whoever walks into the room, I'm going to see them as they walk past the foot of my bed. But because of the top bunk, my view is partially obscured. I wouldn't be able to make out someone's face, for example. I could really only see their middle section, from maybe their knees to their chest. And then the door to our room opens. And this shadow figure walks into the room. And I need to be clear here. I am in a pitch black room, and I can clearly, distinctly make out a black silhouette. It was a shape that was darker than the darkness itself. This thing walks into the room, and because of my obscured view, I wouldn't have been able to see its head or upper body anyway. But its hips are so high up that I can't even really see them. The part of its body that I can see, what should be its waist or hips, is at the level where I would expect to see a normal person's upper body or head. What this means is that the figure that just walked in has extremely long legs. Unnaturally long. If it was proportionally the size of a human, you'd be talking about maybe a 10-foot tall person. And we are in a small cabin room that does not have a 10-foot high ceiling. As soon as I see it, as soon as I make out that black silhouette that is so impossibly tall, and I combine that with all the other strange things I've just processed, mainly the front door still being open, the commotion it made, the weird sound of its footsteps, my brain finally gives up trying to rationalize. I was instantly frozen with terror. Just petrified. My first thought was, that is not Nick's brother. And my second thought was, even if we're not talking about something paranormal here, this is a terrible situation. Even if that's just some random tall person who has wandered into the house, that is a really, really bad situation to be in. So no matter how I sliced it, this was bad. But what I was looking at didn't make any physical sense. It was an unnaturally tall person, they left the door open, and I could hear their impossible footsteps all over the house. It walks in, past the foot of my bed, and I'm just lying there, paralyzed. I can't see higher than its waist because of the top bunk. This thing makes a sharp, precise turn like a military-facing movement, and it begins to walk down the narrow aisle between the queen-size bed in the middle of the room and the bunk bed where I am. It's walking right next to me. I am literally lying there, unable to move a muscle. I remember thinking, I can't do anything. I am truly, completely frozen with terror. And all I can remember thinking over and over again is, whatever happens, whatever you do, just don't bend down and look at me. That will ruin my life. If this thing so much as looks at me, that's it, I'm done for. It walks down the aisle until it's right beside me. I'm holding my breath, I can't move, I'm just a statue of fear. It does another quick, sharp movement, but this time it's facing away from me. It's facing towards Nick, who's asleep in the bed in the center of the room. And then it bows. It bends at the waist, onto and then down through Nick's bed, and it disappears. Now, in the movies, as soon as the ghost disappears into the floor, the person who's hiding would make a run for it. But in real life, there's no such thing as ghosts. There's no such thing as people disappearing into the ground. So my brain couldn't process it. I'm expecting this thing to just get back up again. I couldn't understand that it had just vanished into the bed. That's not possible. So where is it? I clearly heard the door open. I heard the bells. I heard the pot. I heard the footsteps. I saw the door to our room open. I saw the thing walk in. I watched it walk down the aisle. I watched it bend over. It's in the room. Where is it? For hours, all night long, I laid there, absolutely petrified, expecting this thing to come back up from the floor and just look at me. That was my biggest fear. Whatever this thing was, I did not want it to look at me. I was frozen. The only thing I could move were my eyes, darting back and forth in the darkness, searching for any sign of movement. I stayed like that all night. Finally, what felt like an eternity later, I hear Nick's mom out in the living room making coffee. This was probably around 5 or 6 in the morning. And hearing that normal everyday sound was like a switch being flipped. It was the first time I felt like, okay, I'm safe now. Even if that thing is still in this room somewhere, I'm safe enough to move to get out of here because I can hear another person out there. It was a familiar sound, and I knew it was her. So I get up and I go right out there. Now, you have to understand, even though I had just gone through this horrible, unexplainable situation, I was still very aware that she had just lost her husband. The idea of approaching this subject, which would effectively turn into a conversation about ghosts, just felt incredibly inappropriate. I had never had a paranormal experience before this. I've never had one since. I'm more or less a skeptic. And here I was, about to go out and start talking about ghosts to a woman who was recently bereaved. It just felt wrong. So I was really struggling with how I wanted to communicate what had happened. I went and sat down at the dining room table. She got me a cup of coffee. We knew each other well, she's known me for years, and she definitely picked up that something was wrong with me. She didn't ask anything right away, she was just kind of sizing me up, looking at me with a puzzled expression. The only thing I could think to do was to just ask a simple, logical question. I said, hey, did either of your 2 sons, Nick's older brothers, did they stop by at any point last night? She just looked at me and said, no. And I'm just sitting there like, okay. I must have had a reaction that was obvious to her because she then just said, I heard my husband here last night too. And you know, that just made everything 1,000 times worse. Because on the one hand, you have a situation where she is confirming that something real happened, which is terrifying because part of me was desperately hoping it was just a bad dream. But on the other hand, she's now saying it was her husband. So my mind immediately jumped to another conclusion. I intuitively assumed that she had somehow picked up on my stress, figured out that I was spooked about something that probably wasn't real, and because she's grieving, she's created a story in her own mind where her husband is now in the house looking over us. I really believed that she didn't actually hear anything, that she just somehow understood that I'd had this weird feeling, and she turned it into, oh, my husband's in the house. I just couldn't ask any more questions at that point. I felt like I had set her up for this awkward, painful exchange. I felt really bad that this was the discussion we were having. I also thought, if what she's saying is true, I don't want to have this conversation. I was just dumbfounded about what to do. And this was just night 1. There were 2 more nights of this to go. And it gets worse. Eventually, Nick and Wolf come out of the bedroom and join us in the dining room. In the same way I felt reserved about talking to Nick's mom, I had the same feelings about talking to Nick. It was his father we were potentially talking about, and it just felt inappropriate. But Wolf, he's not a family member, he's just my buddy. So I kind of pulled him aside and tried to tell him what was going on as best as I could, but I kept it very generic. I was like, you know, I could have sworn I heard someone in the house last night. And he was like, yeah, you were probably dreaming. That's what that is. And I was like, no, I know I wasn't dreaming, but I can't make sense of it. I said, can you just do me a favor? At this point, Nick actually overheard our conversation, and I kind of quickly changed the subject. I was like, yeah, I just thought I heard something last night. It's just me freaking myself out. I said, can you guys just do me a favor tonight? When we get back from snowboarding, can I fall asleep ahead of you? That way, I'll already be asleep, you guys can come in and fall asleep after me, and then I'll just sleep through the night. And they were like, all right, yeah, weirdo, whatever. My big plan was that I was just going to go to bed really, really early. I hadn't slept at all the night before, so I was thinking, I'll be so tired, I'll fall asleep right away. So we go out, we snowboard for the day. My mind is off of what happened. Frankly, I'm starting to convince myself that it had to have been something like sleep paralysis. Even though I'd never had that before, I was Googling it. People said it feels like a really intense, real dream. I was just thinking, there has to be a logical explanation. This is too weird. It has to be something explainable. Turns out, it wasn't. We get back from snowboarding that evening, and I am immediately going to bed. It was maybe 6 o'clock. I told them I was exhausted and went straight to the room. I get in bed, and all I can think about is what happened the night before. And I can't fall asleep. Eventually, Nick and Wolf come into the room. They're trying their best to be quiet and stay awake so that I can fall asleep, but it's getting later and later, and I just can't do it. Now I'm back to that same place, calculating, okay, if I fall asleep now, I can get 6 hours of sleep. They finally just said, hey man, we're tired, we're going to bed. And they both fall asleep. And I'm awake. Again. And I was so upset with myself. You idiot, you screwed yourself. Why didn't you just fall asleep? I remember the only thing I did that, looking back on it, really shows how real this was to me, is I put a knife, just a kitchen knife from the drawer, in the metal springs of the bunk bed above me. I was on the bottom bunk, so I just tucked it into the frame right under the top bunk within easy reach. And I'm lying in bed, constantly looking over at the red numbers of the digital clock, and it was probably around 3 a.m. again. It was late enough that it was like, okay, this is about the time that it happened last night. And my heart just sank when I heard those footsteps on the wraparound porch again. They sounded exactly the same as they did the night before. I was thinking, that has to be one of Nick's brothers. It has to be. But then the door opens. I hear the sleigh bells. I hear the frickin' pot fall on the ground. It was like deja vu. The exact same sequence of events was happening again. These footsteps start walking through the house. And again, referencing how movies would portray this, the character who's me in the movie would be thinking, okay, I'm going to get this knife, I'm going to position myself over here because I know what's going to happen, and I'm going to protect myself. But in real life, my thought was, this thing is going to be in my room again. It happened last night. It's apparently happening again right now. Please, for the love of God, don't bow into me the way it bowed into the floor the night before. Don't look at me. It will ruin my life. If some entity just engages with me, just looks at me, that will ruin my life. This thing walks down the hall. I hear those echoing footsteps coming down the hallway towards our room. And just for a second, forget the paranormal aspect. Pretend it's the middle of the night, you're in a cabin in the middle of nowhere, and you know a stranger is walking around your house. That alone is horrifying. The footsteps come right outside the door, and I'm looking up at the handle of the knife that's tucked right above me, and I am petrified. I cannot move. I'm drenched in sweat just from the few seconds it's taking this thing to get from the front door to my bedroom door, because I know what's happening. It's happening again. I'm not crazy. It's just happening again. What is this? And I'm so scared. I can't reach for the knife. I'm so worried about making any tiny noise that would alert this thing that I'm here and that I'm awake. I can only move my eyes. I remember even thinking that I shouldn't move my eyes too quickly because it might hear that. This was a primal level of fear. The door opens. It walks into the room. It goes right past the foot of my bed. And again, I am just petrified. It walks down that same aisle after making its sharp turn, the aisle between me and Nick. And I remember what happened the night before, where it folded into Nick's bed and disappeared. And I'm just thinking to myself, please don't turn and bow into me. Please, whatever happens, just don't do that. So it turns away from me, towards Nick, and it does the exact same thing it did the night before. It folds onto Nick's bed and disappears into the ground. But again, even though in a movie, this would be the same thing happening on night 2, the same predictable routine, in real life, my brain is just screaming, where did it go? I know this happened last night, but it still doesn't make any sense. It's in the room. It has to be. This is a real thing. It came into the room, and now it's somewhere. Is it under my bed? Where is it? All night. All night I lay there. This is the second night in a row that I had not slept a wink. When I finally heard Nick's mom out in the other room, it was such a profound relief. Because I didn't give a crap at this point about being polite. I wasn't going to try to dance around the conversation about ghosts. I was going to go out there and be like, what is wrong with this house? So I hear her, and I go right out to the living room, and I tell her everything in as much acute detail as I possibly can. And as I'm telling her this, her reaction didn't line up with what I was expecting. Her reaction wasn't surprise or terror or confusion. It was empathy. She felt bad for me. It was sympathy. Like she was thinking, you don't understand. I'm listening, but you just don't understand what's happening. And I'm telling her all of it, every single detail I can possibly muster. And at the end of it all, she just kind of stops me. She's just like, John, I told you yesterday, and I heard it again last night. That's just my husband. I heard him last night too. You've got nothing to worry about. And I was like, no, that cannot be what this is. And she was like, I heard him open the door. I heard the pot fall. I heard him walk through the house. I'm assuming he went into Nick's room again with you guys. And I'm just like, what is happening? I was totally beside myself. I remember I was actually crying during this conversation. Just crying, not even tears of sadness as much as just pure confusion and helplessness. I felt like I needed my mom. I felt so out of my depth. And no offense to Nick's mom, but I just thought I was with a lunatic. But at the same time, she's recalling the exact same things as me. How do I put those two things together? I remember thinking, I need to leave. I need to get out of here. I can't be here anymore. But then I thought about how I would even make that happen. Nick's mom and Wolf and Nick, they're not leaving today. We had one more day. And it was pretty clear that Nick's mom actually liked the fact that she was hearing her husband walking around the cabin. She wasn't trying to leave. There was one more night that we were supposed to be here. And to leave, I would have to call my parents and tell my mom or my dad to drive all the way to New Hampshire to come get me because I'm seeing ghosts. This was a trip that I loved, that I looked forward to every single year. It wouldn't have made any sense to them. They would have been like, what is wrong with you? And honestly, I was not prepared to have those conversations with my mom and dad. I was not prepared to be like, let me tell you about the 10-foot tall ghost I saw for the past 2 days. So I was just kind of resigned. I decided to stay. In retrospect, I think I should have called my parents and been like, I don't care, get the hell up here. It doesn't matter why, just come get me. But it was such a confusing, overwhelming moment that I had no blueprint for how to handle it. So I just stayed. Nick and Wolf finally get up and come out. I remember I made the decision to stay as I'm sitting there thinking about what's happening while Nick's mom is reassuring me about her husband being in the house. Nick and Wolf come out of the room, and Wolf pretty much immediately looks at me to get a gauge on what happened. And he can see it all over my face. I've been crying. I'm a mess. I told them what happened. And Nick was always kind of a stoic guy. He was just unaffected. He didn't want to engage with it. Wolf, on the other hand, was more inclined to, at a minimum, believe that something was happening. He didn't know if it was a ghost or not, but he certainly understood that something was going on. And the fact that as I'm explaining to Nick and Wolf what's going on, Nick's mom was there reinforcing my story. She was like, yeah, I heard him too. I heard the door open. Yeah, I was upstairs. I heard him walk through the house. And Wolf is just looking back and forth between us like, what is going on? And Nick just didn't want to hear it. It was probably just too uncomfortable. We were ultimately talking about his father. Before we went out snowboarding that day, Nick's mom drove us to a local store. We bought a coffee table. They had been looking to replace the one that was in their house. Basically, when you walked into the house, instead of turning down the hallway towards our room, if you just kept walking straight into that lofted living room area at the foot of the stairs, there was a little coffee table. They kept a landline phone on it because they were in the middle of nowhere and you had to have some way to call for help. The old one had broken or was just old, I don't know, but I knew they'd wanted a new one for a long time. So we went out and got it. Me, Nick, and Wolf, we go snowboard, we come back, we help unload the new coffee table into the house, and we put it right at the foot of the stairs. That night, we go to bed. I was ruthless in trying to keep Wolf and Nick awake. I wasn't even trying to make jokes about it. I was straight up kicking the bunk bed, kicking Wolf's bunk, literally shaking Nick. I was doing everything in my power to keep them awake because I could not sleep. I was terrified. It was like the polar opposite of how excited you get before Christmas and you can't sleep. It was that same level of sleepless anticipation, but instead of joy, it was pure dread. This was the worst night of my life. And the nail in the coffin was that during the day, we had found out that neither of Nick's two brothers were going to be making the trip after all. Their plans had changed. So no one was supposed to be at the house except for the four of us. That night, I'm lying there, and after all my attempts to keep Nick and Wolf awake, they fall asleep. Everyone's asleep. The house is pitch black. It's silent. And around 2 or 3 in the morning, I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it. I hear those footsteps on the wraparound porch. The door opens. I hear the sleigh bells ringing on the door. The pot falls on the ground. And the footsteps walk into the house. This is the 3rd time that this has happened. So in a strange way, this was the first time that I was almost expecting it. I had a script. It was going to walk down the hall, come into the room, come next to me, fold into Nick's bed, and then that would be it. This was the first time I had a little bit of, call it security, in knowing what was supposed to happen. I didn't understand it, but I expected it. But that was not the case this night. It walked into the house. Everything was the same up to that point. But instead of going down the hallway towards our room, it kept walking. It walked straight into the lofted living room area. And from where I was lying in my bed, if I sat up and looked straight ahead, the wall of my room was the only thing separating me from the area where this thing was. I'm talking, if there wasn't a wall there, I'd be looking dead at this thing. And as crazy as it sounds, I'm just waiting for it to walk through the wall. I'm anticipating something coming right through the wall. After a long pause, while it's in that lofted area, I hear it go up the steps. Listening to the slow creak of each wooden step as it goes up the stairs, it makes my skin crawl. It's making me emotional just thinking about how terrifying that was. It walks all the way up the stairs, and now it's directly above me. And if the past 2 nights were any example, this thing has sunk into the ground 2 nights in a row and disappeared. So now my new fear is that it's going to literally come through the ceiling, through the top bunk, and onto me. The sound stopped once it got upstairs. And that's where Nick's mom slept. She was upstairs. So I laid in bed, petrified once again. I've got my stupid knife sitting in the underside of the bed above me. And for hours and hours, I'm just waiting for my literal worst nightmare to come true. For some entity to come through the ceiling and go into me, or even just seeing it out of my peripheries, watching this dark beast come through the ceiling and float down and into Nick's bed. Just these thoughts in my head, they didn't make any sense. They were terrifying, but they felt like they were happening. I laid in bed and I couldn't fall asleep. I was now coming up on 3 full days without any sleep. At some point that night, I did finally fall asleep, probably just out of sheer absolute exhaustion. At some point in the early morning, probably around 5 in the morning, I wake up again, and I hear Nick's mom. But it didn't sound like she was making coffee this time. It sounded like something was wrong. I couldn't place it, but it just sounded like she was emotional. I couldn't tell if she was crying or not. But now, it's the morning, it's my last day, I'm leaving today. I am up, and I am out of that room. As soon as I walk out of the hallway, I look to my left, into the dining room, where I expect to see Nick's mom, and she's not there. She's actually over at the foot of the stairs in the lofted living room area. She's next to this new coffee table we had just put in, and she's standing over this coffee table at the foot of the stairs where the entity had been the night before, the one deviation from the other two nights. And she's crying. She sees me and says, "Come here." She pats the coffee table, and she's down on her knees looking at it. And now I can tell she's probably crying tears of joy. Because scratched deeply into the surface of the brand new coffee table were the words, "I love you." I was done. That was it for me. That experience ended my friendships, certainly with Nick, and with Wolf to a lesser degree. But I never went back. I stopped snowboarding altogether for a long time. I never went back to that cabin, even though I know Wolf went back the next year. The theories about what happened are hard to settle on. It's possible Nick's mom, in her grief, created a narrative and made it all about her husband. And she could have just as easily been the one to scratch "I love you" into that table. It's also possible that we both had some kind of shared sleep paralysis, that we somehow synchronized our visions, and she scratched the words into the table in her sleep. Or, to be honest, what I believe is that that was a ghost. And it interacted with the physical world. It did walk around the house. It did carve "I love you" into that table. And you know, it's the only time in my entire life that anything like that has ever happened to me. I don't have any other paranormal stories before or after. That's it. Let me know what you think really happened in that cabin in the comments. Was it sorrow, hallucination, or was there something truly inexplicable that passed through that house for 3 consecutive nights? And if you want more concerning mysterious encounters and unexplainable true stories, subscribe and turn on notifications to wait for the next video. See you next time. Before dawn on a quiet Saturday in March of 1997, a police captain was making his final patrol through the sleeping outskirts of a small town in North Carolina. The road, a stretch of highway that connected the town to the larger city of Charlotte, was almost completely empty. But up ahead, the captain saw something that didn't belong. There was a red Jeep parked oddly on the shoulder of the road, its headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. It was just sitting there. This was suspicious enough for the captain to slow down and pull his patrol car in behind it. He got out, the air cool and still, and started walking towards the Jeep. As he got closer, he could hear the low hum of the engine. It was still running. He saw the driver's side window was all the way down. But when he walked around to that side of the vehicle and shined his flashlight inside, he saw that nobody was there. The driver's seat was empty. The whole car was empty. He stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. And then a sound cut through the quiet. A cell phone, sitting on the passenger seat, began to ring. In the early morning hours of Saturday, the 29th of March 1997, a 26-year-old waitress named Kim Medlin was finishing up her shift. She worked at a topless bar in Charlotte called the Men's Club, and tonight she was wearing a leotard and tights as she carried a tray of filet mignons through the bustling, smoke-filled room. She navigated past the main stage, where women were dancing, and delivered the food to a table of businessmen. Kim worked here 3 or 4 nights a week, and for the most part, she didn't mind the job. The money was very good, and working the late shift meant her days were completely free. That freedom was important, because it let her focus on the 2 things she loved most in the world: taking care of her horses and turning her brand new house into a home. Kim and her husband Bridger had just achieved a major life goal. They'd bought a beautiful 7-acre plot of land just outside the nearby town of Monroe, which was where Bridger had grown up. They spent the better part of the last year building their dream home from the ground up. They even built a barn for their 3 horses. Now, with all the heavy construction finally done, they were in the middle of moving in, unpacking boxes, and making the place their own. As Kim delivered the stakes, she glanced up at a clock on the wall. She saw she had less than an hour to go, and a little wave of excitement went through her. She had the next 3 days off, and she had big plans. Simple plans, but they were all that mattered to her. She was going to finish unpacking the last of the boxes and finally start hanging pictures on the walls. She flashed the businessmen a quick, professional smile and then moved on to check her other tables. An hour later, just a little after 2 in the morning, Kim walked out the back entrance of the club. She'd changed out of her work uniform and was now wearing a comfortable, baggy sweatshirt. She called out a quick goodbye to a few of her coworkers who were lingering outside, and then walked over to her red Jeep parked along the side of the building. She climbed inside, tossed her purse onto the cow print seat cover on the passenger seat, started the engine, and turned on some music for the hour-long drive home. About 30 minutes later, Kim was driving south down Old Charlotte Highway. It was a secluded 2-lane road that was pretty much completely deserted at this time of night. She used to find this part of her commute relaxing, a quiet time to decompress after a long shift. But lately, driving this road alone late at night had started to make her nervous. The reason was because just a couple of weeks earlier, while driving home from work around this exact same time, she'd been involved in a really scary road rage incident. Another car had come up fast from behind her and started tailgating her aggressively. They were flashing their lights and honking their horns over and over again for absolutely no reason. Kim had been terrified. She thought maybe it was a customer from the club who had followed her, and her mind started racing with all the terrible possibilities. It freaked her out so much that when she saw the lights of a convenience store up ahead, she immediately pulled into the parking lot. Her heart was pounding, but then she felt a huge sense of relief. There was a police car parked right there. She didn't hesitate. She got out of her Jeep and went straight over to the officer to explain what had just happened and ask for help. He was very kind and took her seriously. He promised he would go try to track down the driver who had been harassing her. He even sent out a broadcast over the police radio telling all the other officers on duty to keep an eye out for Kim's red Jeep on the night she was working, just in case anyone ever gave her trouble again. The road rager was never caught, but knowing that the local police were aware of her situation and were looking out for her did make Kim feel a little bit better. Still, the fear lingered. The person was still out there. So tonight, as she drove down that same dark, empty highway, she decided to do something to calm her nerves. She reached into her purse, fished out her cell phone, and called her husband, Bridger. When Bridger answered, he told her he was actually on the road too. He worked as a DJ, and tonight he'd had a gig at a high school prom in a town about 2 hours away. He was just finishing his own drive home. They chatted for a few minutes, the easy conversation of a married couple just checking in. Then, Bridger told Kim that he was just pulling into their driveway. He said he would run inside, get settled, and call her right back. Kim agreed, said goodbye, and they hung up. She kept driving, feeling a little more at ease now. About 15 minutes passed. It was now a little before 3 in the morning. Her phone rang again. Just as he promised, it was Bridger calling her back from the house. He asked her where she was, if she was close. She told him she was just passing the Union Station restaurant, a local landmark. That meant she was only about 20 minutes away from home. Bridger said he was exhausted from his long night and was about to head to bed. Just in case he was already asleep by the time she walked in the door, he wished her a good night. Kim said good night back, told him she loved him, and then she hung up the phone, placing it down on the passenger seat beside her purse. She turned her full attention back to the dark road ahead. But just as she did, a sudden, blindingly bright light filled her car. She instinctively glanced up at her rearview mirror and saw a pair of headlights right on her tail. An hour later, Bridger Medlin sat up in bed. He looked over at the clock on his nightstand. It read 3:59 a.m. It had been a full hour since he'd spoken to Kim. She should have been home 40 minutes ago. She was only 20 minutes away when they talked. A knot of worry started to form in his stomach. He got out of bed and walked through their new 2-story house, checking every room, calling out her name, but Kim wasn't there. There was no sign that she had ever come home. Bridger looked out the front window. Her red Jeep wasn't in the driveway either. Now he was starting to panic. He hurried into the kitchen, picked up the landline, and dialed Kim's cell phone number. The phone rang a few times, and then a man's voice answered. It wasn't a voice he recognized. Confused, Bridger asked who was speaking. The man on the other end told him he was a police officer with the Monroe Public Safety Department. Bridger's heart sank. He asked the officer, "Okay, well, where's my wife?" The officer's reply was not reassuring. He told Bridger that he didn't know where his wife was. He had just come across a red Jeep idling on the side of the highway. He found the phone inside, and when it started ringing, he just answered it. But as for the driver, he said, "There's nobody here." A few minutes later, so a little after 4 a.m., on March 29th, Assistant Chief Bobby Hulk, an investigator with the Monroe Public Safety Department, was driving north along Old Charlotte Highway. He drove past the closed businesses and dark houses until he reached the very edge of town. And then he saw it. Up ahead, a red Jeep parked on the shoulder of the opposite side of the road. There was a patrol car parked right behind it, its lights quietly flashing. Hulk made a U-turn and pulled his own car onto the shoulder. As he got out, he saw Captain David Simpson standing there waiting for him. Simpson quickly filled him in. He'd found the Jeep idling there about 15 minutes ago. Headlights on, engine running, but totally empty. He said he was about to call it in when the cell phone on the passenger seat started to ring. He answered it on instinct, and it was a man named Bridger Medlin, frantically looking for his wife, Kim. Captain Simpson also told Hulk something else that was important. He said he actually recognized the Jeep. He remembered it from a strange run-in he'd had just 2 weeks earlier, outside a convenience store with Kim Medlin herself. He put 2 and 2 together. This was definitely Kim's car, but Kim was nowhere to be found. The name Kim Medlin also rang a bell for Assistant Chief Hulk, but for a different reason. He actually happened to be personal friends with her husband, Bridger. This case was already personal. Hulk pulled out his flashlight and began to carefully look inside the Jeep. Right away, he saw a wallet lying open on the passenger seat. He picked it up and looked inside. There were credit cards and there was cash. But the clear plastic slot in the wallet, the spot where you'd slide in your driver's license, was empty. It looked like the license had been deliberately taken out. The initial theory that popped into their heads was a traffic stop. Maybe Kim got pulled over by an officer and had taken her license out to hand it over. But in a small department like Monroe's, there were only a handful of officers on duty at this hour. Hulk asked Captain Simpson if any of the on-duty officers had reported pulling someone over that night. Simpson was already ahead of him. He had already checked. And the answer was no. None of their officers had made a traffic stop. This immediately made Hulk wonder about something else. Maybe Kim had been pulled over by someone posing as a cop. These so-called blue light bandits weren't common, but there had been reports over the years of criminals using flashing lights to pull over and harass drivers, especially young women driving alone. It was a disturbing thought, but those cases were rare. Hulk didn't want to jump to any conclusions just yet. Just then, Hulk heard the rumble of a truck engine and saw another set of headlights approaching up the highway. He set the wallet back down in the seat and walked over as a black pickup truck pulled to a stop right behind his car. A tall man with blonde hair jumped out of the driver's seat. Hulk knew him immediately. It was his friend, and Kim's husband, Bridger. Bridger looked frantic, his eyes wide with fear and panic. He rushed towards Hulk, demanding to know what had happened to his wife. Hulk tried to calm him down, explaining that they were there to figure that out. He told Bridger what they had found so far, just the car, with no broken windows, no slashed tires, no obvious signs of a struggle. He suggested that it was possible Kim had just run into some car trouble and had walked off to find help. But Bridger wasn't listening. Without asking for permission, he pushed right past Hulk and climbed directly into the driver's seat of the Jeep. He said, "Well, let's test your theory right now and see if the car was working." Hulk, stunned, told him to get out of the Jeep, that it was a potential crime scene. But Bridger completely ignored him. He put his wife's car in drive and moved it forward a few inches. Then he put it in reverse and backed it up, parking it right back in its original spot. He'd just proven the car worked perfectly fine. And in the process, he had potentially destroyed any evidence that might have been there. Hulk was annoyed, but he also couldn't help but think, this is very bad. Whatever happened here, it wasn't car trouble. Something was seriously wrong. Hulk walked over to his patrol car and radioed the dispatcher for reinforcements. He specifically asked for a police dog so they could try to track Kim's scent in case she had left the area on foot. A few minutes later, 2 more police cars arrived, and a few officers and a canine handler with his dog got out. Hulk opened the doors to the Jeep, and the dog jumped inside, sniffing around the seats and the floor, getting familiar with the scent of Kim and her belongings. After a moment, the dog seemed to pick up a trail on the ground next to the car. The officers told Bridger, who was pacing back and forth and clearly wanted to follow them, to stay put by his truck. Then they followed the dog as it led them down the dark road for about 100 yards. Then the dog made a sharp turn onto a long, private driveway. Hulk and the other officers followed the dog up the driveway, which led towards a small house nestled among some trees just off the highway. The dog sniffed all the way up to the garage of the house, and then it stopped. The trail ended right there. Hulk went up to the front door of the house and rang the doorbell. A minute later, a man answered. Despite the late hour, he looked wide awake, and he didn't seem particularly surprised to see a group of police officers on his doorstep. Hulk asked the man for his name and if he had seen or heard anything unusual in the past couple of hours. The man said his name was Nathan Hargett. He told them that about an hour ago, maybe around 3:45 a.m., he'd been woken up by the sound of a strange car loitering near his garage. Nathan said he hadn't recognized the car, but he did notice that it had Texas license plates. He also told them he'd seen a woman with blonde hair in the back seat. Hulk asked Nathan for permission to search his property, and Nathan immediately agreed. Hulk directed the other officers to search inside the house while he went over to the garage. He found a side door on the garage and tried the handle. It was unlocked. He pushed the door open and shined his flashlight inside. But all he saw was a pickup truck and some gardening tools. There was no sign of Kim. By the time the sun started to rise around 6 a.m. that morning, this was officially a missing persons case. Police, with the help of concerned members of the community, began a massive search of the woods and fields surrounding Old Charlotte Highway. Meanwhile, Hulk and Captain Simpson went back to the police station to speak with one of the dispatchers who had been on duty the night before. After interviewing Nathan Hargett and searching his property, they had ruled him out as a suspect. So now, their focus shifted to that mysterious car with Texas plates that Nathan had seen. They were hoping that maybe there had been a report of a traffic stop or a call about a suspicious car in the area, anything at all that might help them figure out who was driving that vehicle. But the dispatcher told them the same thing. It had been a quiet night, no stops, no suspicious vehicle reports. However, she said, there had been one minor incident in the area that night. It was around 2 a.m., which was about an hour before Kim was last heard from. They had gotten a call about a car that had run into a ditch not too far from where Kim's Jeep was ultimately found. Hulk asked which officer had responded to that call. The dispatcher said it was car 491, which was driven by a young rookie officer named Josh Griffin. Hulk immediately got Officer Griffin on the phone. He asked him if he had seen or heard anything unusual while he was out there responding to the car in the ditch. But Griffin said no. He explained that his shift was technically already over when a driver had flagged him down for help. So he had just called for a tow truck, and when it arrived a little after 2:30 a.m., Griffin said he simply went home. Hulk hung up the phone, feeling disappointed. Bridger had said the last time he spoke to Kim was around 3 a.m. If the car in the ditch was already being towed away by 2:30, then it definitely wasn't the same car that Nathan saw outside his garage an hour later. And the driver of that car was likely not involved. Hulk sighed in frustration. But then, another idea occurred to him. He asked Captain Simpson to tell him more about that random run-in he'd had with Kim 2 weeks earlier. It felt like a long shot, but Hulk wondered if maybe the same driver from that road rage incident could have come back, found her again, and maybe chased her off the road. Simpson said he would go dig up the report he had filed on the incident and left to go find it. About half an hour later, Hulk sat at his desk reading through a copy of the police report. It stated that in the very early morning hours of Saturday, March 15th, exactly 2 weeks before Kim's disappearance, Kim had pulled into a convenience store and flagged down Captain Simpson and another officer who was with him, an officer named Roger Griffin. It turned out that Officer Roger Griffin was actually the father of Josh Griffin, the rookie officer who had responded to the car in the ditch. The report went on to say that Simpson and his partner, Roger Griffin, had actually managed to catch up with the car that had been harassing Kim a little further down the road. There were 2 men inside, Eric Williams and George Connell. They claimed that they thought Kim was the one harassing them by flashing her high beams. To Simpson and Griffin at the time, it had all seemed like a big misunderstanding, so they had just let the 2 men go with a warning. But Hulk, looking at this report through a very different lens now, felt that he needed to speak with Eric and George, regardless of what the report said. He found their contact information and called them both. But it turned out both men had rock-solid, airtight alibis for the entire night of Kim's disappearance. Still, something about it bothered Hulk. It struck him as an incredible coincidence that Kim had gone missing from her car on the exact same road at the same time of night and on the same night of the week as the road rage incident just 2 weeks prior. He had a very hard time believing it was all just a coincidence. The next day, just after sunset on Sunday, March 30th, Hulk was driving down Westwood Industrial Drive. It was a deserted, dead-end street at the edge of town, about 2 miles from where Kim's Jeep had been found. As he drove, he saw a couple of police cars parked at the end of the street. He pulled his own car in behind them and got out. He walked into the woods, following the beams of several flashlights that were moving around in the darkness. As he got closer, he saw officers putting up yellow police tape around a small clearing. And then, on the ground in the center of that clearing, he saw a pair of feet in sneakers poking out from underneath a messy pile of roofing shingles and tree branches. The police had gotten a call earlier that evening from 2 men. They were part of the community search effort for Kim, and they had told the dispatcher that they had found a body in the woods at this spot, but that they hadn't touched anything. Now, with Hulk on the scene, the forensics team began to carefully remove the shingles and branches that were covering the body. Hulk pulled out his own flashlight and knelt down to get a better look. He saw immediately that it was a deceased woman. And there was no doubt in his mind that it was Kim Medlin. She was only wearing a pair of shorts, a bra, and a sweatshirt that had been violently pulled up over her head. One side of her face was very badly beaten. There were cuts and bruises all over her neck and scrapes on her knees consistent with a struggle. He noticed that her necklace and her wedding ring were still on. This wasn't a robbery. Hulk stood back as the forensics team worked. They carefully untangled Kim's sweatshirt from around her wrists so they could take clippings of her fingernails just in case she had managed to scratch her killer and leave behind a trace of their DNA. As Hulk watched one of the forensics officers get ready to put the sweatshirt into an evidence bag, he suddenly noticed something and shouted for the officer to stop. Hulk stepped closer and shined his flashlight directly onto the fabric of the sweatshirt. And there, illuminated in the beam of light, was a clear, distinct shoe print. He immediately told the officers to send that sweatshirt directly to the crime lab and see if they could figure out the size and the type of shoe that had left that print. He knew he would have to wait for those results, but he already had a couple of other big clues to help him narrow down a list of suspects. The first was the location of Kim's body. Westwood Industrial Drive was known locally as a lover's lane, a secluded, out-of-the-way spot where people often went to be alone. The fact that Kim's killer had thought to bring her body here meant they were probably a local, someone who knew the area well. It was still theoretically possible that she'd been run off the road by a random stranger, or that a customer had followed her home from work, or even that it was a blue light bandit. But the second big clue pointed away from a stranger. There was no sign of a struggle at Kim's Jeep. Because of that, Hulk didn't think she had been kidnapped by a stranger. He thought it was far more likely that she had willingly gotten out of her car for somebody that she knew and trusted. The very next day, Monday, March 31st, Hulk sat down in an interrogation room across from his friend and his first official murder suspect, Kim's husband, Bridger. From the very beginning, Bridger had been overly involved in the investigation. He had contaminated the crime scene by getting into the Jeep without permission. And now, Hulk had received information that Bridger had lied about his alibi. When Kim first went missing, Bridger had told the police that he got home around 2:30 that morning, called Kim for a brief chat a little before 3, and then immediately went to bed. But now, another police officer had told Hulk that he had personally seen Bridger's black pickup truck driving around the center of town around 2:30 a.m., which was nowhere near Bridger's house and not on the route he would have taken home from his DJ gig. As soon as Hulk sat down, he could see that Bridger was visibly distraught. He had just learned that his wife had been found murdered. But Hulk had a job to do. He cut right to the chase. He told Bridger that another officer had seen his truck in town, that it contradicted his alibi, and he asked him, "Why did you lie?" Immediately, Bridger exploded. He was furious. He shouted at Hulk, saying he couldn't believe that at a time like this, Hulk would accuse him of lying. He was insinuating that he had hurt his own wife. He yelled that he didn't do this. He also shouted at Hulk for wasting precious time looking at him as a suspect when there were so many other clues pointing to a different story. He brought up the lack of a struggle at the Jeep, the rolled-down window, and the missing driver's license, all of which, he argued, made it look like a traffic stop that had gone horribly wrong. Bridger said he knew Kim better than anyone, and she would never, ever get out of her car in the middle of the night for a stranger, especially not after that terrifying road rage incident just 2 weeks earlier. She was on edge. She just wouldn't have done it. When Hulk left the interrogation room a few minutes later, he told his team to track down any and all security footage they could find from around town on the night Kim was killed. They needed to see if there was any proof that Bridger was really driving around when he claimed he was at home. For now, they had no physical evidence linking him to the crime, and they had to let him go. But Bridger's anger and defensiveness stuck with Hulk. It made him suspicious. And the fact that Bridger had insisted his wife would never have gotten out of her car for a stranger only reinforced Hulk's own theory. She might not have gotten out for a stranger, but she might have gotten out for you, Bridger. Or, Hulk thought, she might have gotten out for the police. Hulk already knew that no official Monroe police officers had pulled anyone over that night, but someone could have been pretending to be a police officer, a blue light bandit. That theory still made a lot of sense. Hulk thought about that bulletin that had gone out over the police radio 2 weeks ago, the one telling officers to be on the lookout for Kim's Jeep. Police radios were not private channels. Anyone with a simple police scanner could have been listening in. And what they would have heard was that a young woman named Kim often drove down this particular road all by herself late at night. They could have been waiting for her, knowing she was a vulnerable target. So Hulk picked up his phone and began calling around to other police departments in the region. He actually found out there had been 2 separate recent reports of blue light bandits harassing women. One of the culprits had already been caught, and he was in jail on the night Kim was killed, so it couldn't have been him. But the other suspect was still at large and had never been found. A couple of days later, on April 4th, Assistant Chief Bobby Hulk slammed his phone down in frustration and crossed another name off a list on his notepad. It had been 5 days since Kim's body was found, and all the initial leads he'd had were turning into dead ends. His team had tracked down surveillance footage from the night of Kim's disappearance. There was no sign of Bridger's truck driving through town until well after 4 a.m., after Kim's Jeep had already been found by Captain Simpson. It seemed the officer who claimed to have seen Bridger's truck at 2:30 a.m. had simply been mistaken, just as Bridger had furiously insisted. So Bridger's alibi was solid. Hulk had also reached out to Kim's manager and coworkers at the bar, thinking maybe her killer was a patron who had followed her. But none of them knew of any problems or issues she'd had with any customers. Meanwhile, Hulk's team had located and spoken to a man who worked the night shift at a business near where Kim's Jeep had been found. He said he had left work a little before 3 a.m. on the night Kim disappeared. As he was waiting to turn onto Old Charlotte Highway, he saw her red Jeep drive past. And right behind it, he saw another car that had been going in the opposite direction make a sudden, sharp three-point turn and speed off after the Jeep. The man said this other car had lights on the roof and reflective tape on the back. He had assumed it was a police car, but he didn't get a good look at the markings. Now, Hulk knew for a fact that every single Monroe police officer who was on duty that night was accounted for, and none of them had pulled anyone over at the time Kim went missing. However, this new witness testimony certainly did support the theory that Kim's killer was posing as a police officer. It supported the blue light bandit theory. So Hulk had spent the last couple of days trying to track down any witnesses who had seen that other blue light bandit, the one who was recently reported in a nearby town but had never been caught. But he kept coming up dry. No one knew anything that could help him track down that suspect. It really seemed like the investigation was grinding to a halt. But then Hulk's phone rang. He answered it. It was an expert from the forensics lab. He had just finished analyzing the shoe print that had been found on Kim's sweatshirt. Hulk leaned forward in his chair, a feeling of nervous anticipation washing over him as the expert told him the results. And when he heard what the expert had to say, Hulk knew exactly how to find Kim's killer. Based on that shoe print, witness testimony, and other forensic evidence, this is what police believe happened to Kim Medlin on the 29th of March 1997. Around 3 a.m., the killer was driving down Old Charlotte Highway. They had been out prowling for hours, sometimes pulling over young women for minor traffic violations, sometimes for no reason at all, just to exert their authority. And as they drove, they saw a familiar red Jeep pass by. The killer had seen that Jeep driving down this same road several nights a week for the past couple of weeks. They had become obsessed with the young blonde woman who drove it. And tonight, they decided it was finally time to act on that obsession. So they pulled an abrupt, aggressive three-point turn, raced up behind the Jeep, and flipped on their car's flashing blue and red lights. A moment later, the red Jeep pulled over onto the shoulder as expected. The killer got out of their car and walked up to the driver's side window. The woman inside, Kim, rolled down her window. She handed over her driver's license, and then she politely asked what the problem was. The killer didn't answer her question. Instead, they just told her to get out of the car. Kim was visibly confused, but she was dealing with a police officer, so she did as she was told. The moment she was out of the car, the killer slapped a pair of handcuffs onto her wrists, dragged her over to their patrol car, and shoved her into the back seat. Then, the killer got back in their own driver's seat as Kim started crying in the back, insisting that she hadn't done anything wrong, asking why she was being arrested. But the killer wasn't listening. Their mind was racing. They realized that even though they had been fantasizing about this moment for weeks, they hadn't actually planned what to do next. So, after a moment, they pulled their car over to the side of the road and just idled for a minute trying to figure out their next move. And then, an idea came to them. They put the car in drive and continued down the highway, turning onto a secluded dead-end road. As they drove down this dark road, Kim, in the back seat, suddenly went very quiet. The killer noticed the silence and looked in the rearview mirror. They saw her moving around, fiddling with something behind her back. And then the killer realized, with a jolt of panic, that in all their excitement, they had forgotten to engage the child's safety locks on the rear doors. The killer immediately reached for the power lock button on their own door, but it was too late. The rear door flew open, and Kim jumped out of the moving car. The killer slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a hard stop. They leaped out and ran back towards Kim, who was lying in the middle of the road, her hands still cuffed behind her back. Without even thinking, the killer raised their heavy-duty flashlight and smashed it into the side of Kim's head. Then they stomped on her back, breaking her neck. But the killer wasn't done. They knelt down, put the long metal flashlight against Kim's throat, and then pulled back on both ends, creating a makeshift garrote. They pulled as hard as they could, until Kim stopped moving. After she was dead, they dragged her body off the road and deep into the woods. There, they removed the handcuffs and hastily covered her body with loose branches and debris they found nearby. Then, the killer went home and meticulously cleaned their car, making sure there was no evidence that would tie them to the murder. But they didn't realize they had left behind one crucial, damning piece of evidence at the scene, that shoe print on Kim's sweatshirt. The print had a very distinct V-shaped pattern on its tread, which made it very easy for forensics to identify. Weeks later, the crime lab traced that print back to a specific shoe made by the Thorogood Company, a well-known supplier of military and uniform footwear. And that particular model of shoe happened to be the exact same one that was issued to every officer in the Monroe Public Safety Department. Kim's killer was not just posing as a police officer. They were a real police officer. The killer was Officer Josh Griffin, the off-duty rookie cop who claimed he had simply responded to a car in a ditch and then gone home a half an hour before Kim went missing. It would later turn out that Josh had learned all the details about Kim's vehicle and her late-night driving patterns from his own father, Officer Roger Griffin. After his father and Captain Simpson had responded to Kim's road rage complaint on March 15th, Roger had casually told his son about the incident. And from that moment, Josh had become obsessed. He had been on the lookout for Kim's Jeep ever since, just waiting for his chance. Josh Griffin was arrested on the 30th of May, 1997, about 2 months after Kim's murder. He was eventually convicted of first-degree kidnapping and first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison. As for his motive, the prosecution argued that he had become fixated on Kim after hearing about her from his father and, in an act of horrific violence, decided to abduct and kill her. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.